On the morning of the 6th of May 1960, a photographer with a shortened left leg stood in a private room at Clarence House, while a valet fussed over the hang of his morning coat, and somewhere across London, in a house he knew well, a woman 8 months pregnant with his child was deciding whether she could bear to switch on the television. That is the whole marriage, compressed into a single morning, before a word of it had been spoken aloud in Westminster Abbey. Antony Armstrong-Jones was 29 years old that day. He had no title, no land, no private income worth the name, and 2 incomplete years of an architecture degree he had failed out of at Cambridge. What he had was a studio on Pimlico Road, a motorcycle, a reputation among the theatrical set for being the most interesting man in any room he entered, and an engagement to Princess Margaret Rose, the sister of the Queen of England, the second daughter of a king, the most photographed young woman in Britain and possibly in the world. He also had a mistress named Camilla Fry, who was married to his closest friend and who would give birth to his daughter 3 weeks later. Nobody in that abbey knew. Not the Queen, who sat in the front row and who is described in more than one account as looking as though she were attending a difficult diplomatic function rather than her only sister's wedding. Not the Queen Mother, who had spent months telling anyone who asked that she was delighted and who spent the next 40 years failing to hide that she was not. Not the 2,000 guests in the nave, not the hundreds of thousands lining the route to the river, and not the 300 million people watching on television sets from Sydney to Toronto, because this was the first royal wedding ever broadcast live by cameras from inside Westminster Abbey, and the British public had turned out for it, in a state of something close to joy. Margaret did not know either. She would find out eventually, though it took 44 years and a DNA test before it was confirmed, rather than whispered, and by then, she had been dead for 2 years and could not be told. I want you to hold that image for a moment, because everything that follows grows out of it. A cathedral full of people celebrating a fairy tale, a bride who genuinely believed she had finally been allowed to choose, a groom who knew exactly what he was concealing and walked down that aisle anyway, smiling for the cameras he had spent his professional life on the other side of. Before we go any further into it, do me a favor. If you find yourself pulled into this one, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell, because we go this deep every week, and I would rather you did not have to go looking for us. Now, there is a version of this story you already know, and it is the version that has been repeated so often it has calcified into something that resembles fact. In that version, Princess Margaret is a spoiled, drinking, chain-smoking royal who threw away a good man's love, and Lord Snowdon is a talented artist who married into a family that could not accommodate him and who eventually fled a difficult woman. It is tidy. It absolves almost everybody. It has been told by newspapers, by television dramas, by dinner party historians with a confident manner and no sources, and it is close enough to the shape of the truth that most people never examine it. The documented record tells a considerably uglier story, and the ugliness runs in a very particular direction. I am going to lay out what is on the record. The books this is built from are Anne de Courcy's authorized biography of Snowdon, published in 2008, with his cooperation and his blessing, which is the single most damning document about him that exists precisely because he did not fight it. Craig Brown's Ma'am Darling, which is the most forensic account of Margaret's life anyone has written. Anne Glenconner's Lady-in-Waiting, the memoir of the woman who served as Margaret's lady-in-waiting for something close to 30 years, and who watched the interior of that marriage from a distance of about 4 feet. Christopher Warwick's authorized Life of Margaret, contemporary press coverage, court circulars, letters. Where something is disputed, I will tell you it is disputed. Where something is theory dressed as fact, I will say so, and then let you decide what you think of it, because you are perfectly capable of doing that yourself, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Here is a sample of what is coming. There is a handwritten note. Its existence is confirmed by 3 separate sources who had no reason to coordinate, and its wording is identical in all 3. Tony wrote it, folded it, and left it somewhere his wife would find it alone. Accounts differ on where. One says a glove drawer, one says tucked into a book she was reading. The words do not differ at all. He told her she looked like a Jewish manicurist and that he hated her, and then he signed off with a line about honesty, as though he had done her a service. That was not an outburst in the middle of a row. Tony did not do outbursts. That was a considered, drafted, physically written object that he made with his hands and placed where he knew she would be by herself when she found it. The distinction matters, and we will come back to it. There were more. Anne Glenconner describes a list, left where Margaret would see it, headed with something to the effect of 24 reasons why I hate you. She describes a man who would go silent for days at a stretch inside Kensington Palace, lock the door of his study, and then walk out the next morning and be charming to a photographer on the pavement. She describes dinner parties at which Tony would work the table with genuine wit and then turn, mid-laugh, and say something about his wife's appearance, or her intelligence, or her age, that landed like a slap and left the other guests studying their plates. The servants at Kensington Palace developed protocols. That is not a figure of speech. Staff who worked in that apartment in the early 1970s described a working method for moving between rooms in a specific order at specific times in order to avoid putting the Earl and the Princess in a corridor together, because nobody could predict what would happen if that occurred, and everybody knew that whatever happened, they would be the ones cleaning up after it. 2 children grew up inside that. David, born in 1961, Sarah, born in 1964. Both of them have spent their adult lives declining, with great courtesy and great firmness, to describe it in any detail. That declining is its own kind of testimony. There is also the matter of what Tony did in 1976, which I consider the coldest single act in this entire story, and which has been consistently underreported because the tabloid version of that year is so loud that it drowns out the mechanics underneath it. You will have heard about the Mystique photograph. February 1976, the news of the world. Princess Margaret in swimwear, beside a landscape gardener 17 years her junior, named Roddy Llewellyn. It was the making of the modern British tabloid, and it very nearly finished her. What almost nobody says is what her husband did with it. He did not defend her, he did not commiserate. He had been waiting years for exactly that kind of opening, and when it arrived, he took it to the palace and used it to push for a formal separation on terms that positioned him as the injured party, the loyal husband whose wife had humiliated the monarchy in a newspaper. He had been conducting affairs continuously since before the engagement, every single one of them, and he cashed in hers. The separation was announced in March of that year. The divorce came through on the 11th of July, 1978. 5 months after that, Tony married a 27-year-old film researcher named Lucy Lindsay Hogg. Margaret never married again. There is a woman in this story called Anne Hills, and I want to warn you now that when we get to her, it does not get better. She was a journalist. She was Tony's mistress, on and off, for around 20 years, running underneath both of his marriages. Her friends described a clever, funny woman who became steadily more unhappy about a position she could not change. She took her own life on New Year's Eve, 1996. Tony was told that evening. He went to the party he had been planning to attend. I am not going to editorialize on that when we reach it. I am going to give you the sequence and then say nothing, and you can do with it what you like. And then, because this story refuses to be simple, there is the other Tony. The man who joined the Sunday Times magazine in 1962, the first colour supplement in British newspaper history, and used it to send photographers into psychiatric hospitals and mining villages and the back streets of the industrial north, and printed what they brought back in full colour on the breakfast tables of a country that had spent 15 years congratulating itself on the end of poverty. The man who co-designed the aviary at London Zoo, that huge angular thing in tension steel that you can still see from the canal path in Regent's Park, and who did it without ever having finished an architecture degree. The man who made a documentary about growing old that won 2 Emmy Awards. The man who lived his whole life with a leg that polio had shortened when he was 16, and who spent decades of that life fighting in the House of Lords for disabled people, at a moment when almost no other peer in that chamber could be persuaded to care. That work was not a performance. Everyone who has examined it closely, including the people least sympathetic to him, has concluded the same thing. He meant it. He put real effort and real political capital into it over a period of decades, at no obvious benefit to himself. He cared about disabled Britons he had never met, with an intensity he could not summon for the woman asleep beside him. So you are going to be asked, over the next 2.5 hours, to hold 2 things at once, and I am telling you in advance that you will not manage to reconcile them, because nobody has. Now let me set the frame properly, because the marriage does not make sense without understanding what each of these two people was carrying when they met, and both of them were carrying a great deal. Start with her, because her wound came first, and it was inflicted in public. Princess Margaret Rose was born on the 21st of August, 1930, at Glamis Castle in Angus, 4 years and 4 months after her sister Elizabeth. She was born into a position that had a name in every royal family in Europe, and no job description in any of them. The heir does a thing, the spare exists in case the thing goes wrong. Everybody understands this arrangement. Nobody says it out loud to the child in question, and the child works it out anyway somewhere around the age of 6. Margaret worked it out at exactly 6, as it happens, because that was when her uncle abdicated. Before December 1936, the Yorks were a side branch. Her father, Albert, was the second son, a shy man with a stammer that cost him visible physical effort every time he had to speak in public, and he had no expectation of the throne and no appetite for it. The family lived at 145 Piccadilly and at Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park in a manner that was luxurious by the standards of the country and almost domestic by the standards of the monarchy. There were dogs. There were parents who were in the room. Elizabeth and Margaret were educated at home by a governess, Marion Crawford, and they were, by every surviving account including their own, happy. Then Edward VIII gave up the crown for Wallace Simpson, and the shy second son became King George VI, and the world reorganized itself around the two little girls in a single winter. Elizabeth was 10. She was taken aside and told, in the careful and euphemistic manner of the institution, what her life was now going to be. Constitutional history lessons began. Vice provosts of Eton arrived to explain the workings of the state to a child. Margaret was 6, and nobody took her aside at all, because there was nothing to tell her. Her life had changed completely, and her function had not changed even slightly. She had been the second daughter of a duke, and she was now the second daughter of a king, and the arithmetic of her importance had been altered by precisely nothing. She noticed. Children notice. There is a story from that period, and it is one of those anecdotes that has been repeated so many times that its origin has become hard to trace. So treat it as illustrative rather than as documented fact. In it, small Margaret asks her sister whether the abdication means Elizabeth will one day be queen, and Elizabeth says yes, and Margaret then asks whether that means she herself will be anything, and there is no good answer available. Whether or not the exchange occurred in those words, the shape of it is accurate, because the shape of it is confirmed by everything Margaret said and did for the following 65 years. What she developed instead of a function was a personality, and it was formidable. She could sing properly, not in the way that royal children are complimented for singing, but in a way that made professional musicians pay attention, and she played the piano well enough that Noel Coward, who was not a generous judge of amateur performance, went out of his way to say so. She did impressions. She was very funny, in the specific way of people who watch a room closely and notice the gap between what everyone is saying and what everyone actually means. She had a gift for the withering aside that people found delightful right up until the afternoon it was aimed at them. Household staff who served the family during the war years described the two sisters in language that gives the whole thing away without meaning to. Elizabeth was spoken of with respect. Margaret was spoken of with a kind of nervous fondness, the way people talk about weather that is beautiful and might turn. She was, in other words, the interesting one, and being the interesting one in an institution that has no use for interesting is a difficult position to occupy for a lifetime. The war put both girls at Windsor. Their parents stayed in London through the Blitz, which was the single most effective public relations decision the monarchy made in the 20th century, and which also meant that Elizabeth and Margaret spent their adolescence in a castle, that is, whatever else it is, a very cold building that knows how important it is. Elizabeth turned 18 in 1944 and joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service and learned to change a lorry tire and was photographed doing it. Margaret turned 18 in 1948, by which point the war was over, her sister was married, and there was no equivalent for her to do. On the 8th of May 1945, the two of them were let out of the palace by their parents and allowed to go into the crowds on the Mall, incognito, to celebrate the end of the war in Europe. Elizabeth remembered it for the rest of her life as an extraordinary evening of anonymity. Margaret, who was 14, appears to have remembered it as something slightly different, which is a glimpse of what the next 40 years were going to feel like. There was a version of ordinary life happening out there. She had now been inside it for one night. She was never going to be allowed into it again, and unlike her sister, she had not been given anything substantial to put in its place. Her father adored her. This is worth saying clearly because it complicates the picture of the neglected spare in a way that matters. George VI was besotted with his younger daughter in a manner that everybody around the family noticed, and that at least some of them thought was doing her no favors. He indulged her. He found her funny when she was being outrageous, and he laughed when he ought to have corrected her, and he seems to have understood, in the way that a father sometimes understands things he cannot articulate, that he had given his elder daughter a purpose and his younger daughter nothing, and that some form of compensation was owed. The compensation took the form of permission. Margaret was permitted a latitude in her behavior that no other member of that family was permitted, and she grew up understanding charm as a currency and misbehavior as a form of visibility. Then, in February 1952, her father died at 56, and every protective structure in Margaret's life came out from under her at once. She was 21. Her sister became queen, which meant that the one person who had understood her position from the inside was now permanently on the far side of a constitutional wall. Her mother, widowed at 51, collapsed into a grief she managed with a formidable public composure and never entirely came out of. The household at Clarence House reorganized around the two of them, mother and second daughter, in a domestic arrangement that would last for years and which suited neither of them particularly well. And Margaret, in the middle of that, was in love with a man in her father's household. Group Captain Peter Townsend was a Battle of Britain pilot, which in 1950s, Britain was roughly the highest social credential available to a man without a title. He had joined the royal household in 1944 as an equerry to George VI, one of a group of decorated servicemen brought in to modernize the king's staff, and he had stayed. He was handsome in an unshowy way, he was courteous, he was calm, and the king had come to rely on him. He was also 16 years older than Margaret, and he was married with 2 young sons. Townsend's marriage to Rosemary Paul was already in trouble before Margaret entered the picture, and he divorced her in 1952 as the innocent party, which was a legal distinction that mattered a great deal in that decade, and which turned out, in the end, to matter not at all, because the Church of England did not recognize the innocent party distinction in the way that Margaret and Townsend needed it to be recognized, and the Queen was the supreme governor of the Church of England, and Margaret was third in line to the throne, and the whole thing collapsed under the weight of an institution that had spent the previous 16 years defining itself against exactly this situation. The abdication was the reason. It has to be understood as the reason, because without it the entire episode looks like arbitrary cruelty rather than institutional terror. 16 years earlier, Margaret's uncle had given up the throne to marry a divorced woman, and the monarchy had come closer to falling over than it had at any point since the 17th century. Her father had spent the remainder of his shortened life absorbing the consequences of that decision, and everybody in the building believed the stammering and the smoking and the early death were part of the bill. The men who ran the palace in 1953 had lived through it as adults. Tommy Lascelles, who had been private secretary to Edward VIII and then to George VI, and was now private secretary to the new Queen, had watched the whole thing at close range and had drawn a permanent conclusion from it. So when Margaret told her sister she wished to marry a divorced man, the machinery did not deliberate. It simply began, with enormous politeness, to make it impossible. The public found out on the 2nd of June, 1953, Coronation Day. Margaret, in the Abbey, in front of the world's press, reached out and brushed a piece of fluff from the lapel of Peter Townsend's uniform. It was an entirely trivial gesture, and it was also the gesture of a woman who is comfortable enough with a man to touch his clothing in public, and an American reporter caught it, and the story went around the world within a day. Townsend was posted to Brussels as air attaché within weeks. Margaret was told she would have to wait until she was 25, at which point, under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, she would no longer require the sovereign's consent. She waited. For 2 years she waited, and the country waited with her, and the newspapers ran countdown pieces. And when she turned 25 in August 1955, the whole thing came to a head in the space of about 10 weeks. What she discovered was that the 25-year clause had been a piece of arithmetic rather than a promise. Freedom from the sovereign's consent did not mean freedom. It meant the matter would go to Parliament, and the government of the day made it understood that Cabinet would not approve, and that the Commonwealth Prime Ministers were opposed, and that the practical consequence of proceeding would be Margaret's renunciation of her rights of succession, her royal title, her income under the civil list, and, in all probability, her ability to live in Britain. On the 31st of October 1955, she issued a statement. It is a short document, and it is one of the more painful things in the modern royal archive, and the operative line is that, mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of her duty to the Commonwealth, she had resolved to put these considerations before others. She was 25 years old. She had done exactly what the institution required, and the institution, having got what it wanted, offered her nothing whatsoever in return, because there was nothing it had ever been designed to give her. The Margaret who came out the other side of 1955 was not the same woman who had gone into it. Everyone who knew her says so. The wit acquired an edge that could take skin off. The drinking, which had been social, became structural. She began the lifelong habit of insisting on the precise observance of her royal rank in situations where nobody had suggested otherwise, which is the behavior of a person who has been made to understand that rank is all she has, and who has decided to hold on to it with both hands. She was also, at 25, extremely lonely, extremely famous, and extremely available. I have compressed the Townsend years into a few paragraphs, and they deserve more, because what was done to her between 1953 and 1955 is the foundation of everything that follows, and the mechanics of how it was done are worth setting out in detail. Not because it is dramatic, because it was so extremely polite. Nobody ever forbade Princess Margaret from marrying Peter Townsend. That is the first thing to understand, and it is the thing that made it so effective. There was no confrontation, no scene, no royal command. What there was instead was a series of gentlemen in morning coats making arrangements, and each individual arrangement was reasonable, and the cumulative effect of them was a wall. Start with Tommy Lascelles, because he was the engine of it. Sir Alan Lascelles, known as Tommy, was private secretary to the sovereign, and he had held or shadowed that post through the reigns of 3 kings. He had been assistant private secretary to Edward VIII, and he had resigned in disgust before the abdication because he had concluded, correctly, that the man was unfit. He had then served George VI throughout the war and the Reconstruction, and he had watched at the closest possible range what the abdication cost that man physically. And by 1952, he was private secretary to a 26-year-old queen who had been on the throne for a matter of months. Lascelles was not a villain, and it does no good to write him as one. He was a man of considerable ability and considerable rigidity who had personally witnessed the monarchy nearly fall over because of a divorced woman, and who had spent 15 years watching the bill for it being paid by a king who died at 56. When Princess Margaret's situation arrived on his desk, he did not have to think about it. He had already thought about it for 16 years. His reported reaction to being told that Margaret and Townsend wished to marry was that Townsend must be either mad or bad. That phrasing has come down through several accounts, and the wording may not be exact. The sentiment is not in dispute. Now look at what actually happened, step by step, and notice that no step is a refusal. Townsend had been in royal service since 1944, and by 1952, he was Deputy Master of the Household and Comptroller to the Queen Mother's household at Clarence House, which meant he lived and worked in the same building as Margaret. That was the first thing to be adjusted. It was not framed as a punishment, it was framed as a promotion, or at least as a normal move in a career, and he was appointed Air Attaché to the British Embassy in Brussels. Brussels, not Ottawa, not Johannesburg, not somewhere that would have looked like exile and generated sympathetic coverage. A short flight from London, a genuine diplomatic posting appropriate to his rank, entirely defensible in any newspaper, and approximately 300 miles from the woman he wanted to marry, in a job that would keep him there for years. The timing of that posting is the part that Margaret never forgave. She had been given to understand that Townsend would be moved after her sister's Commonwealth tour, which would have allowed them some months. He was moved in July 1953, before she returned from her own trip to Rhodesia. She came back, and he was gone, and the arrangement had been made while she was out of the country. That is not a refusal either. It is a diary decision. Second step. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which had been passed by George III because he was irritated by his brothers marrying commoners, required the sovereign's consent to the marriage of any descendant of George II under the age of 25. Over 25, consent was not required, but the intending party had to give 12 months' notice to the Privy Council, and Parliament had to not object. Margaret was 22 in 1953, so she was told, entirely accurately, that she would need to wait until she was 25, at which point the Act would no longer require her sister's consent. Everybody in that building understood what that sentence was doing. It was not a prohibition, it was a deferral, presented as a legal fact, which converted an immediate crisis into a 2-year waiting period, during which anything might happen. Townsend might change his mind. Margaret might change hers. She was 22. 2 years at 22 is an enormous span of time, and the men who set the clock knew that perfectly well. And she accepted it, because it came dressed as law rather than as opinion, and because she was 22, and her father had been dead for 18 months, and the alternative was a fight with her sister. She waited 2 years. The country waited with her, and this is the part that is genuinely hard to imagine now. There were newspaper countdowns. There were features about what she might wear. Public opinion, insofar as it was measured, was substantially in her favor, and it grew more favorable as the 2 years went on, because a young woman being kept from a war hero by a rule about his divorce was an extremely sympathetic proposition to a country that had recently spent 6 years being told that the war heroes were the best of us. She turned 25 on the 21st of August 1955. Townsend came to London in October. They spent time together at Allenby Park in Berkshire, at the House of Friends, with photographers outside in numbers that had no precedent. And then, over about 3 weeks, she found out what the 25-year clause had actually been. Because being free of the sovereign's consent did not mean being free. The matter went to the government, and the government of the day was Anthony Eden's, and Eden himself was a divorced man who had remarried, which people at the time thought might help and which turned out to be irrelevant. Cabinet took the position that it could not advise in favour. There were consultations with Commonwealth Prime Ministers, and the responses were not encouraging. And the mechanism that was put in front of Margaret was this. If she married Peter Townsend, she would have to renounce her rights of succession. She would lose her royal title and her style. She would be removed from the civil list, which meant her entire income. And it was made clear that the couple would need to live abroad, at least for a period, because the position of an ex-royal princess married to a divorced man in Britain was not one the palace was prepared to have to manage. Some historians have argued in recent decades, on the basis of documents released later, that the situation was more negotiable than she was allowed to believe, and that a version existed under which she could have married him and kept a modified position. That argument exists, and it is worth knowing about. What matters for understanding Margaret is not whether a better deal was theoretically available. What matters is what she was told, and what she was told was that it would cost her everything she had. She was 25. She had no profession. She had never earned a pound in her life, and had no way of learning how. She had been raised inside an institution that had given her no function, and had now presented her with a bill for leaving it. Townsend was 40, and an heir attaché on a service salary, with 2 sons to support. On the 31st of October 1955, the statement was issued from Clarence House. It is very short. It says that she wishes it to be known that she has decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. It says she has been aware that, subject to her renouncing her rights of succession, it might have been possible for her to contract a civil marriage. And then it says the line that has been quoted ever since, which is that mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of her duty to the Commonwealth, she has resolved to put these considerations before any others. Townsend helped her draft it. That detail comes from him, in his own memoir, and it is one of the sadder facts in the whole episode. The two of them sat down together and composed the document that ended it, and they got the wording right, and it is a good piece of writing, and it was published under her name. Now think about what that statement did to her over the following 47 years. She had made a public declaration of principle. She had invoked the indissolubility of Christian marriage, in her own name, in a document that was reprinted in every newspaper in the world. That statement was in the Cuttings Library. It was available to any journalist at any time, which meant that in 1976, when the separation was announced, and in 1978, when the divorce came through, every single newspaper in Britain had the option of running her own words from 1955 alongside the news, and a number of them took it. She was made to write the sentence that would be used against her 23 years later. There is one more element of the Townsend business that matters for what came afterwards, and it is about how she was treated in the immediate aftermath by the institution she had just protected. Nothing changed, that is the answer. There was no new role. There was no expanded portfolio, no serious job, no acknowledgement of any kind that she had done something difficult on the institution's behalf. She went back to the diary of engagements she had been doing before, and she was expected to do them cheerfully, and she was 25 years old and had just been publicly and permanently disappointed in front of the entire world. The behavior that everybody complained about for the next 4 decades starts here. The lateness, the insistence on precedence, the 3 in the morning bedtimes, and the staff working double shifts to accommodate them. The drinking, the capacity to freeze out a friend of 20 years over a remark. I am not offering that as an excuse, because plenty of people have terrible things happen to them at 25 and do not spend 40 years making their employees miserable, and the staff who worked for her were not responsible for any of it and did not deserve it. What I am offering it as is an explanation of the mechanism. She had learned, at 25, with total clarity, that rank was the only thing she actually had. Not affection, not purpose, not autonomy. Rank. The institution had taken the man and left the title, and so she held the title with both hands for the rest of her life, and made everybody in the room acknowledge it, and the people who suffered most for that were the ones who could not refuse. Townsend married Marie-Luce Germain in December 1959. She was 19 years old, and she looked, in the photographs, startlingly like the young Princess Margaret, and the resemblance was widely commented on at the time by people who had the decency not to put it in print. They were married for 36 years and had 3 children, and by all accounts, it was a good marriage. He died in 1995 in France. His memoir, Time and Chance, came out in 1978, which was the year of Margaret's divorce, and he was scrupulous in it. He did not sell her. He described what happened with restraint, and he declined to trade on any of it, and that restraint is more or less the only kindness anybody in a position of advantage extended to Margaret in the whole of her adult life, which is the condition in which she was sitting when, at a dinner party in Chelsea in 1958, somebody introduced her to a young photographer with a limp. To understand what walked into that dinner party, you have to go back 30 years and about 200 miles northwest, to a marriage that was already failing when its only son was born into it. Antony Charles Robert Armstrong-Jones arrived on the 7th of March 1930 in London, 5 months before Princess Margaret was born at Glamis. His father was Ronald Armstrong-Jones, a Welsh barrister with a successful practice, a family seat at Plas Dinas in Caernarvonshire, and what his son's biographer would later describe, with the delicacy that biographers reserve for men who are dead and whose relatives are not, as a highly sexed nature. In the England of the 1930s, that phrase carried a specific meaning, and everybody understood it. Ronald could not keep his hands to himself. He did not much try, and his wife knew. His wife was Anne Messel, and she was one of the most photographed young women in London society. The Messels were not aristocracy. They were something arguably more interesting, a family of German Jewish descent who had come to England in the 19th century and made money in the city, and then spent 3 generations converting that money into cultural position with a persistence that eventually worked. Anne's grandfather was Linley Sambourne, the Punch cartoonist whose house in Kensington is now a museum. Her brother was Oliver Messel, who became one of the great stage designers of the 20th century, a man whose sets for Glyndebourne and Covent Garden defined a whole post-war visual manner in British theatre. So the boy was born into money on both sides, talent on one side, and a marriage with about 5 years left in it. It ended in 1935. Anne divorced Ronald and remarried within a very short interval, and she remarried extremely well. Michael Parsons, the 6th Earl of Ross, came with Birr Castle in County Offaly, a demesne of some 120 acres, one of the great gardens of Ireland, and a title that turned Anne Messel into the Countess of Ross. Tony was 5 years old, and he was sent to Ireland with her, and what happened next is the thing that everybody who has written about him agrees was the origin of everything. Anne already had 2 children by Ronald, Tony and his older sister Susan. She then had 2 sons with Lord Rosse, and those 2 boys, the Parsons boys, were the heirs of Birr. They belonged to the new life. They had the right surname, the right father, the right position in the house. Tony had the wrong surname, a divorced barrister for a father, and no place in the arrangement at all. Anne de Courcy, who wrote The Authorized Life with Snowdon's full participation, describes the household in terms that are almost startling in a book its subject approved. She writes of a boy who was close to an intruder in his own mother's second family. There is a story, and this one is documented rather than folkloric, of Tony arriving at Birr for the holidays and being put in a room that had been chosen for its distance from everybody else. Take a moment with what that does to a child. His mother was not absent. She was there, in the same building, being warm to 2 other boys in front of him, and being correct and slightly impatient with him. Absence you can grieve and eventually file away. Being visibly ranked 4th out of 4 by a parent who is standing in the room is a different injury, and it does not scar over in the same way. He went to Eton, which was expected, and he was not happy there, which was also fairly common and rarely acknowledged. He was small. He was not sporting in the ways that mattered. His mother was a countess in Ireland, and his father was a barrister in London, and neither of them came very much. Then, in 1946, when Tony was 16, the family was on holiday at Plasdinas in Wales, and he became ill. I want to be precise about this, because the story gets told wrong constantly, and you will find the wrong version in obituaries and in newspaper features and in more than one book. He did not contract polio at Eton. He contracted it in Wales during the holidays, and he was taken by ambulance to the Liverpool Royal Infirmary, and he was there for 6 months. 6 months. Understand what polio meant in 1946, 9 years before the Salk vaccine. It was the thing that parents in Britain and America genuinely feared above almost anything else, because it arrived without warning in the summer, it took healthy children, and it either killed them or it took their legs, and there was nothing whatsoever that medicine could do about it, except wait and see which of those 2 outcomes you were going to get. Wards full of children, iron lungs at the end of the corridor for the ones whose diaphragms had gone. Long, boring, frightening months of not knowing what you were going to be able to do when it was over. During those 6 months, Anne Messel, Countess of Ross, visited her son twice. The reasons that have been offered are that she was afraid of infection and that she found illness distasteful. Both of those may well be true. Fear of infection was not irrational in 1946, and plenty of parents were frightened. It is also the case that other parents went anyway. The people who did go, week after week, were his father Ronald, the man she had divorced, and his older sister Susan, who was in her early 20s and who sat with him. He came out of Liverpool alive and walking, which was a better result than a great many children in that building got. His left leg came out shorter and thinner than his right. He had a limp for the remaining 70 years of his life, and he spent a considerable part of those 70 years arranging his body, his clothing, his photographs, and his social manner so that you would notice it as little as possible. Something else came out with him. Every biographer who has looked at Snowdon has reached for the same explanation, and I am going to give it to you with the same caveat, all of them attach, which is that this is an interpretation and not a fact. The reading is that a 16-year-old boy lay in a hospital bed in Liverpool for half a year, learned that the person who was supposed to come did not come, and concluded from that experience that he would never again allow himself to be the one who is left, that he would leave first, that he would be the one who withholds, who goes cold, who walks out of the room, and that if there was going to be a wound in any relationship he entered for the rest of his life, he would be the one holding the knife. You are allowed to reject that. It is neat, it is retrospective, and it explains a very great deal, rather too conveniently. What I will say is that when Anne de Courcy put a version of it to him in his final years, he did not argue. He went up to Jesus College, Cambridge, to read architecture, and it went about as well as you would expect from a young man with that temperament and that recent history. He failed his second-year examinations and left without a degree. Before he left, though, he did the thing he was proudest of. In March 1950, Antony Armstrong-Jones sat in the stern of the Cambridge boat as coxswain in the university boat race, and Cambridge won. Consider what that meant to him. The cox is the smallest man in the crew, the one whose physical limitations are the entire point of his selection, the one who does not row and instead steers and shouts and holds 8 much larger men to a rhythm for 4¼ miles. A boy with a withered leg, who had been ranked last in his mother's house, and who had spent half a year in a hospital bed, took the tiller of the Cambridge 8 and beat Oxford on the Thames in front of 250,000 people. He kept the medal for the rest of his life. It was in his study when he died. Architecture being finished, he drifted into photography, and in retrospect, there was never going to be anything else. The Messel eye was in him. He had grown up around Oliver Messel's drawings and Oliver Messel's sets, and the family understanding that the visual arts were a serious profession rather than a hobby for people with money. He apprenticed under Baron Nahum, who worked professionally under the single name Baron, and who was, at that moment, one of the 2 or 3 most connected photographers in Britain. Baron did the court work. Baron did the society portraits. Baron was a close friend of Prince Philip and a founder member of the Thursday Club, the raucous all-male lunch society in Soho that Philip attended and that gave rise to a quantity of rumour that has never entirely settled. Baron was also, until his death in 1956, the photographer who took Princess Margaret's official portraits. Hold on to that, because it is the thread. Tony trained under the man who photographed Margaret. When Baron died, there was a gap at the top of that particular profession, and a young man who had learned the trade in Baron's studio was extremely well positioned to fill it. He set up on his own on Pimlico Road, and then he did something clever. The society photographers of that era worked in a particular way: formal, lit, arranged, the subject composed and slightly ennobled, the resulting print flattering and inert. Cecil Beaton was the master of it, and Beaton was very good indeed, but by the mid-1950s, the style had become a costume that everybody was wearing without asking why. Tony went the other way. He photographed people in motion, off balance, mid-sentence, caught. He got in close. He used available light where the convention was to use a great deal of expensive equipment. He photographed the theatre world rather than the aristocratic world, or rather, he photographed the moment when those two worlds were beginning to dissolve into one another, which is exactly the moment that Britain was living through and which nobody else in his trade had quite noticed yet. Laurence Olivier sat for him. Vivian Leigh sat for him. Marlene Dietrich sat for him. His portraits from that decade still have the quality that made his reputation, which is that every subject looks as though they have just finished saying something worth hearing and are waiting to see whether you were paying attention. He was, by 1957, the most fashionable photographer in London, and he was 27 years old. Now we need to talk about a part of his life that the palace spent decades behaving as though it had never heard of. Antony Armstrong-Jones was bisexual. In the world he moved in, the theatrical and artistic London of the 1950s, this was not a secret. It was simply not printed, because until 1967, sexual acts between men were criminal offences in England and Wales, and newspapers did not print things that could destroy a man and expose the paper to a libel action at the same time. The interior designer Nicky Haslam, in his memoir Redeeming Features, wrote about a brief affair with him. Others in that circle spoke about it after Snowdon's death, with the freedom that death allows. And Snowdon himself, when de Courcy raised it with him for the authorised book, produced one of the more artful sentences in modern British memoir. He said that he did not fall in love with boys, but that a few men had been in love with him. Read it twice, and notice what it does. It denies nothing. It concedes everything and admits nothing. It positions him as the object rather than the participant, which is a very old defensive move, and it is also, in its careful construction, the sentence of a man who has thought about this a great deal and arrived at a form of words he can live with. His documented relationships with women in that period were numerous and overlapping. Actresses, dancers, assistants from his own studio, wives of friends. The pattern was established long before Margaret, and it did not alter for a single year of his life afterwards. And then there is Jeremy Fry. Jeremy Fry was of the Fry chocolate family, an engineer and inventor of real ability, and he was one of Tony's closest friends in the world. Fry was married to a woman named Camilla, and the two couples, or rather the two men and Camilla, existed in the kind of intimate, overlapping, weekend cottage friendship that the English Upper Bohemia specialized in. Through 1959, while he was secretly courting the sister of the Queen of England, Tony Armstrong-Jones was also conducting an affair with his best friend's wife. Camilla Fry became pregnant. Her daughter, Polly, was born on the 28th of May, 1960. The wedding at Westminster Abbey had taken place on the 6th of May, 22 days earlier. Do the arithmetic on that, and then sit with it, because the arithmetic is the story. On the morning he married Princess Margaret in front of 300 million people, Tony knew that a woman he had been sleeping with was in her 9th month, and he knew who the father was, and he went to the Abbey. Polly Fry was raised as Jeremy Fry's daughter, and Jeremy Fry raised her, and by every account raised her well. The rumor circulated in that social set for decades in the way that such rumors do, spoken about at dinner and never in print. In 2004, a DNA test settled it. Polly was 44 years old when she learned, with scientific certainty, that the man in all those newspaper photographs was her father. Snowdon acknowledged her. Jeremy Fry, who had spent 44 years being her father, in every sense that counts, never said a public word about any of it. Which tells you something about Jeremy Fry. That is the man who was introduced to Princess Margaret at a dinner party in Chelsea. The introduction happened in 1958, and there is a persistent version of it that puts it at a Rothschild house, and that version is wrong. Christopher Warwick, who wrote Margaret's authorized biography with her cooperation, and de Courcy, who wrote Tony's with his, both place it at a dinner given by Lady Elizabeth Cavendish at number 5 Chain Walk in Chelsea. Lady Elizabeth was one of Margaret's ladies-in-waiting and a close friend, and she was also, for decades, the companion of the poet John Betjeman, which gives you the flavor of the household. Chain Walk, not Rothschild. The detail matters only because of how often it gets repeated wrongly, and because a story this scrutinized deserves to have its small facts right. What happened at that table was that a 28-year-old princess, who had spent 3 years being brave in public, met a 28-year-old photographer who was funny, irreverent, physically unlike anybody in her ordinary life, entirely unimpressed by her rank, and extremely good at making a person feel that they were the only interesting thing in the room. That last skill deserves attention, because it is the one that mattered. Making somebody feel seen is the core competence of a portrait photographer. Tony had spent 5 years professionalizing it. He could walk into a studio containing a nervous actress who had been photographed 1,000 times and make her feel, within 10 minutes, that she had never actually been looked at before. Margaret had been photographed more than any woman in Britain and had never once, in her entire life, been looked at rather than at. The courtship that followed was a piece of operational secrecy that would have done credit to a government department, and it worked for a year and a half in a country where every newspaper in Fleet Street had a standing brief to find out who Princess Margaret was going to marry. The mechanism was a room in Bermondsey. Tony rented the upper floor of number 59 Rotherhithe Street, a semi-derelict house on the south bank of the Thames, downriver from Tower Bridge, in an area that was then working docks and warehouses and pubs for men who worked in them. The room had a window that looked straight out at the water and the shipping. It had cold water, peeling wallpaper, and no heating worth the name. It was, in short, exactly the kind of romantically squalid bolt hole that a fashionable young artist rents in order to demonstrate that he is not fashionable, and it was perfect. Margaret came, repeatedly, over a period of many months. She was driven down in an unmarked car. She sat on the floor by that window, and drank and smoked, and watched the barges, and was, for a few hours at a time, a woman in a room with a man, rather than the third person in the order of succession. And Fleet Street never found it. And the reason Fleet Street never found it is worth understanding, because it is genuinely funny. The entire British press had made an assumption. Margaret was going to marry a landed man. After the Townsend disaster, the received wisdom in every newsroom in London was that the palace would steer her towards somebody suitable, which meant a duke's son, or an earl's nephew, or one of the 6 or 7 eligible young men with a title and an estate, whose movements were therefore watched with great attention. Nobody was watching a freelance photographer with a motorcycle. He was invisible because he did not exist within the category the press was searching. They were quartering the ground for a coronet, and he did not have one. There is one more thing about the timing of the engagement, and it is the part of this story that I find saddest, and it is documented directly. In late February 1960, Princess Margaret received a letter from Peter Townsend. He wrote to tell her that he had met a young Belgian woman named Marie-Luce Germain, and that he intended to marry her. Margaret confirmed this sequence herself to Christopher Warwick for the authorized biography. She received that letter, and within the same week, she accepted Tony's proposal. The engagement was announced on the 26th of February 1960. I am not going to tell you that she married Tony because Townsend married somebody else, because I do not know that, and neither does anybody else, and Margaret was capable of loving 2 men in a decade like any other adult. What I will tell you is that the letter arrived, and the proposal was accepted inside 7 days, and that Margaret herself put those 2 events next to each other when she talked about it. And she was not a woman who did things by accident when she was telling her own story. Marie-Luce Germain, incidentally, was 19 years old and had a strong physical resemblance to the young Princess Margaret. People noticed at the time. Townsend married her in December 1959 and stayed married to her until his death. The public reaction to the engagement was enormous, warm, and slightly bewildered. Margaret had been the tragic heroine of the decade, and now she was marrying a photographer, and the papers could not decide whether this was a triumph of modern romance over stuffy protocol, or a young woman settling for something beneath her, so they ran both takes, often on the same page. The palace reaction was colder than anything printed. Antony Armstrong-Jones was the first person without a title to marry the daughter of a British king in something like 400 years. The courtiers of 1960 were men who had been formed by the 1930s, and their private assessment of the situation was conveyed in the nickname that went round the private secretary's corridor, which was the Jones boy. Said the way you would say it about a tradesman's son who had got above himself, which is precisely how it was meant. The Queen Mother, who had considerable social antennae and considerable capacity for a cold shoulder, delivered through perfect manners, never warmed to him. Not in 1960, and not in the 42 years afterwards. She was faultlessly polite to her son-in-law for the entire duration of the marriage, and everybody in the family understood exactly what the politeness was doing. The wedding took place on Friday the 6th of May 1960 at Westminster Abbey. It was the first royal wedding in history broadcast live by television cameras from inside the Abbey, and the decision to permit that was contested inside the palace right up until it was made. Around 300 million people watched. 20,000 people lined the route. The Britannia was waiting at Tower Pier to take the couple to the Caribbean for a 6-week honeymoon. Margaret wore a Norman Hartnell dress of white silk organza, deliberately plain in line, with a full skirt and a 30-foot tulle veil, and she wore the Poltimore tiara, which she had bought at auction herself, a detail that people who love this story always mention because of what it says about her. She did not have a tiara of her own that suited. She went out and got one. Tony wore morning dress and walked up the aisle without visibly favoring his left leg, which took work. The photographs from that day are extraordinary, and you have almost certainly seen them. Margaret looks luminous, and about 10 years younger than she had looked in 1955. Tony looks pleased in a contained, watchful way. The Queen, in every frame in which she appears, looks like a woman attending an event about which she has private reservations that she will be taking to her grave. Historians have made a good deal of that expression over the years, and it is probably worth less than they think, because Elizabeth II's face at public occasions was a notoriously unreliable guide to Elizabeth II's opinions. Somewhere across London, Camilla Fry was 8 months pregnant. The wedding itself is worth staying with a little longer, because the arguments the palace had about it in the spring of 1960 were arguments about the future of the monarchy, and almost nobody involved understood that at the time. The first fight was about the cameras. Permitting television inside Westminster Abbey for a wedding had no precedent. The coronation had been broadcast in 1953, over the objections of the cabinet and Churchill personally, and the Queen had overruled them and been proved right, and 27 million people in Britain had watched it. But a coronation is a religious ceremony of state. A wedding is a family event, and there was a substantial body of opinion inside the palace holding that a family event should not be broadcast, that the cameras would produce spectacle rather than dignity, and that once you had let them in for one wedding, you would never get them out again. That last objection was correct in every particular, which is the interesting thing about it. The men making it were not being stuffy. They had identified precisely what was going to happen, and they were overruled anyway, and it happened. The argument for broadcasting was partly about Margaret. She was, at that moment, the most sympathetic member of the family, in the eyes of the public. The young woman who had done her duty in 1955, and had waited, and had now been allowed to choose. A televised wedding would be a popular event, and the monarchy in 1960 was not in trouble, but it was aware of a change in the national mood, and it wanted the popularity. So the cameras came in. The BBC ran the broadcast. Estimates of the worldwide audience run to about 300 million people, which at that date made it one of the largest shared events in human history. The second fight was about the guest list, and specifically about who was not coming. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor were not invited. Margaret's uncle, the former Edward VIII, and the woman for whom he had given up the throne, were not asked to the wedding of his niece. That was standard by 1960, and it surprised nobody, and it is worth stating anyway, because of the shape it puts on the day. A woman who had been prevented from marrying the man she loved because of a divorce was being married in an abbey from which the family's own divorce scandal had been excluded, and the exclusion was enforced by the same people who had enforced the prevention. Foreign royalty largely stayed away too, and the reason given in most accounts is that the European courts regarded a marriage to an untitled photographer as beneath the occasion. Whether that was the real reason, or a convenient one, is unclear at this distance. The effect was that the Abbey was full of British guests, and a great many of them were Tonys, which had never happened at a royal wedding before. That is the detail from the 6th of May 1960 that I find genuinely remarkable and that gets very little attention. Antony Armstrong-Jones had a guest list. He was permitted to invite his own people, and his own people were actors and designers and photographers and writers from Pimlico and Chelsea, and they sat in Westminster Abbey among the hereditary peers and the diplomatic corps. Jeremy Fry had originally been asked to be best man. That is documented, and it is one of the more extraordinary facts in this whole story, because it means that Tony's first choice to stand beside him at the altar was the husband of the woman carrying his child. Fry withdrew a few weeks before the wedding. The public reason given was jaundice. The private reason, which has been reported consistently since, was that a spent conviction of Fry's for a homosexual offense had surfaced in a security check, and the palace could not have it. So a man was removed from the wedding party over a conviction for something that would cease to be a crime 7 years later, and the man who replaced him was Dr. Roger Gilliatt, a neurologist, who was a considerably safer proposition, and who had the additional advantage of not being the husband of anybody Tony was sleeping with, so far as anyone knows. Camilla Fry attended the wedding, 8 months pregnant, in the Abbey, watching. I have gone back and forth on whether to state that plainly, and I have decided that I should, because it is on the record, and because the standard telling of this story has her somewhere else in London listening to it on the radio, and the truth is worse, and it is documented. The two Frys were on the guest list, and Camilla was there. The service began at 11:30. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Geoffrey Fisher, conducted it. Margaret was given away by the Duke of Edinburgh, since her father was dead and her uncle was not present, and there is a persistent story that Prince Philip made a remark to her as they set off up the aisle about whether she was sure, and that she laughed. Like most of the good royal anecdotes, that one has no reliable single source and has been attached to several weddings, so treat it as a story. The dress was Norman Hartnell, and it was, by the standards of that designer, extremely restrained. White silk organza, 30 yards of it, a fitted bodice, a very full skirt, no decoration whatsoever, and a veil of silk tulle. Hartnell had built the coronation gown out of embroidery and symbolism, and he had built the Queen's wedding dress out of 10,000 seed pearls, and for Margaret he produced a shape and nothing else, and the reason was that Tony had opinions about it, and Tony's opinions won. That is worth noticing. The bride's dress at a royal wedding in 1960 was designed to the specification of the groom, because the groom was a professional visual artist who understood how the photographs would look, and because he intended the photographs to be good. She wore the Poltimore tiara, which she had bought herself at auction in 1959, for about £5,500. It is tall and it is Victorian, and it converts into a necklace, and she wore it high on her head, with her hair swept up beneath it, which was an unusual and slightly theatrical choice, and it is the single most recognizable image of her in existence. The detail people always mention about that tiara is that she went out and bought it. She did not have one that suited her, and there was no obvious loan available from the family collection that she wanted, so she attended an auction and acquired her own. It sold again in 2006, after her death, for nearly £1 million. The bridesmaids were led by the 8-year-old Princess Anne. There were 8 of them, and they wore white, and they were photographed exhaustively. After the service, the couple came out into a London that had turned out in enormous numbers. The route to Tower Pier was lined with crowds estimated in the hundreds of thousands. They travelled in the glass coach, and at Tower Pier they boarded the royal yacht Britannia and sailed for a 6-week honeymoon in the Caribbean. 6 weeks. Consider the scale of that against a modern royal honeymoon. The Britannia took them to Trinidad, Tobago, Antigua, Dominica, St. Lucia, and Mustique, and the trip cost a sum that was reported in Parliament and complained about at length, and it was the beginning of Margaret's lifelong association with the Caribbean and with one island in particular. Mustique enters the story here. Colin Tennant, later Lord Glenconner, had bought the entire island in 1958 for about £45,000. It was 3 miles long, it had no electricity, no water supply worth the name, and a population of a few hundred people. Tennant was a friend of Margaret's from before the marriage, and he was one of those people whose life project is the arrangement of other people's amusements, and he had given her, as a wedding present, a 10-acre plot of land on the island. She went to look at it on the honeymoon. She kept it for 40 years, and eventually built Les Jolies Eaux on it, and the house was designed with substantial input from Oliver Messel, Tony's uncle, which means the villa that became the symbol of Princess Margaret's extravagance, and that the newspapers used against her every single year until she died, was designed by her husband's family. The honeymoon was, by all accounts, happy. There are photographs of the two of them on the deck of Britannia and in the water, and they look like what they were, which was a couple in their late 20s who had just got married and were pleased about it. They came back to Britain in June 1960. Polly Fry had been born on the 28th of May, while they were at sea. Somewhere in the Caribbean, on the royal yacht, on his honeymoon with the Queen's sister, Antony Armstrong-Jones, learned or already knew that he had become a father. There is no record of what he did with that information. He said nothing about it for 44 years. The marriage began happily. That is important, and it gets forgotten, because the ending is so bad that everybody reads it backwards into the beginning. For the first 3 or 4 years, by the consistent testimony of everyone who saw them, Tony and Margaret were in love, and it showed. He photographed her constantly, and the pictures from that period are the best portraits of her that exist. She was proud of him, in a way that royal wives were not usually permitted to be proud of anything. He made her laugh. She defended his career fiercely, inside a family that regarded professional work by an in-law as faintly embarrassing. For a short time in the early 1960s, they were the most glamorous couple in Britain, and they knew it, and they enjoyed it. Then a title arrived, and a child arrived, and something began to go wrong. The title came in October 1961, and it came for a reason that had nothing to do with honouring Antony Armstrong-Jones. Margaret was pregnant. The child would be a grandchild of King George VI and a nephew or niece of the reigning queen, and under the rules as they stood, that child would be born to a father who had no title, which meant the child would be plain Master or Miss Armstrong-Jones. The palace found this intolerable. On the 6th of October 1961, by letters patent, Tony was created Earl of Snowdon and Viscount Linley of Nymans. He had refused a title at the time of the wedding. That is on the record, and it is one of the more interesting things he ever did. When it was offered before the marriage, he turned it down, and the reasons he gave were about not wanting to be absorbed, about remaining a working photographer, about the whole point of him being that he had arrived from outside. Some people found that admirable. The courtiers found it insolent, which was probably part of the appeal. 18 months later he took it, because the alternative was his son being born without one, and because by then he had learned what life inside that family was actually like, without rank to protect you. David Albert Charles Armstrong-Jones, Viscount Linley, was born on the 3rd of November, 1961. Lady Sarah Frances Elizabeth Armstrong-Jones followed on the 1st of May, 1964. The Snowdons lived at apartment 1A, Kensington Palace, a substantial house in all but name, 20 rooms of it, on the west side of the palace complex. They also had Old House at Nyman's in Sussex, and Tony kept a studio, and Margaret kept the establishment that came with being a princess, which meant a private secretary, a lady-in-waiting, a dresser, a chauffeur, and a household budget that came out of the civil list and that was scrutinized in Parliament by men who resented every pound of it. That last detail matters more than it looks. Margaret's money was public money and everybody knew it. Tony's money was his own, earned, and he made a point of it. Inside that marriage was a permanent and unspoken accounting problem, which was that one partner was paid by the state for existing and the other was paid by newspapers for working, and each of them held that fact against the other in a different direction. Before the temperature changed, there was one period in which the whole gamble looked as though it might pay off for everybody, and it lasted about 3 weeks in the autumn of 1965, and it is worth spending time on, because it is the high watermark, and because the way it ended tells you what was already wrong. In November 1965, the Snowdons went to America. It was a semi-official tour, and the framing of it was cultural and commercial. They went to Washington and San Francisco and Los Angeles and Arizona and New York. They were received at the White House by Lyndon Johnson, and in Hollywood, they were received by absolutely everybody, because in 1965, a genuinely glamorous British princess, married to a genuinely fashionable photographer, was the single most interesting social proposition available in Southern California. The guest lists from that trip read like a fantasy. They dined with the Kennedy family. There was a party at the Beverly Hills house of Sharman Douglas, whose father had been American ambassador in London and who was one of Margaret's oldest friends, and the room contained Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton and Fred Astaire and Judy Garland and Paul Newman and Alfred Hitchcock and Gene Kelly and Julie Andrews and Natalie Wood, and Margaret sang. She actually sang, at the piano, with Astaire and Garland in the room, and everyone who was there described it afterwards as one of those evenings that people spend the rest of their lives mentioning. Tony was in his element. This was his world, extended and amplified. These were photographers and directors and performers, which meant they were his colleagues rather than his wife's subjects, and for the first time since the wedding, the two of them were operating in a social environment where his currency was worth more than hers. The American press adored them. The coverage was ecstatic, and back in Britain, the coverage was the beginning of everything that came later. Because the trip cost money, and the money was public, and the questions started before they had landed back at Heathrow, there was a row about the cost of the RAF transport. There were questions in the House about the itinerary, and about how much of it had been official, and how much had been a holiday at the taxpayer's expense. A Labour MP named Willie Hamilton, who would spend the next 20 years as the most persistent critic of royal finance in Parliament, began the campaign that made his name, and Margaret was his preferred target for the whole of it. That is the pattern in miniature, and it was established in 1965. She went abroad. It was glamorous. It was reported as glamorous in America and as extravagant in Britain. She was asked to justify her existence in financial terms by men who never asked the same question of her brother-in-law. But the more important thing that happened on that trip was between the two of them, and it happened in Los Angeles, and it was noticed. Several accounts from that tour describe the specific dynamic that would define the rest of the marriage arriving fully formed. Tony was surrounded by people who wanted to talk to him about work. Margaret was surrounded by people who wanted to look at her. He was the interesting one in the room for the first time, and he liked it very much indeed, and she could feel the change in the weather and had no way of addressing it. There is an account of an argument in a hotel that ended with him leaving and going out for the evening without her. There are accounts of him being sharp with her in front of American hosts who had no idea what they were watching and who assumed it was English humor. And there is the fact, which is documented, that on a tour designed to display a marriage, the two of them at several points arranged their days so as to spend as little of them as possible in the same room. They came home in December 1965 to a press row about money and a public that was, for the first time, slightly less enchanted. After that, the pattern that everybody describes settled in over about 2 years. Tony took on more work and took it further away. In 1967 and 1968, he was traveling constantly for the Sunday Times, and he began the documentary work. And each of those commitments was legitimate, and each of them was also an exit. There is a detail from this period that is small, and that I think is the most revealing thing in the whole marriage. He installed a lock on the door of his study at Kensington Palace, and he had a light fitted, or in some accounts a system of signs, which indicated whether he could be approached. Staff have described this. The interior of that apartment operated, in the late 60s, on a signaling system devised by the husband, which told his wife and his household whether he was currently available to be spoken to. Set that against what he did for a living. He was a portrait photographer. The entire basis of his professional reputation was the ability to make another human being feel completely attended to, and in his own house, he built a mechanism to inform his wife, without having to speak to her, that she did not currently qualify. Margaret responded in the way that people respond when they have no functional means of raising a grievance, which is by escalating the terms. The hours got later. She began to fill the house with her own circle, the theatrical and social friends who were on her side, and to hold court among them in the evenings while he worked or was absent. The drinking, which had been evening drinking, moved earlier. Her own affairs began in this period, and the sequence is worth stating because it matters for any assessment of blame. Tony was unfaithful before the wedding. Margaret's first documented involvement outside the marriage is Anthony Barton, in 1966, 6 years in. Robin Douglas Home came in 1967. The Douglas Home episode deserves a paragraph because it prefigures Roddy and because it ended badly. He was a pianist and a writer, a nephew of the former Prime Minister Alec Douglas Home, and he was charming and unstable and in serious financial trouble. The involvement with Margaret was brief and by her standards indiscreet, and it ended in 1967. In October 1968, he took his own life. He was 36. Margaret was blamed for it in some quarters at the time, unfairly and without any evidence, and the episode frightened her badly, and she was more careful afterwards for several years. 2 more things about the middle of that marriage, both documented, both of which get left out of the standard account. The first is that they went on working together professionally, and it went well. Tony photographed Margaret repeatedly across the whole marriage, including deep into the bad years, and the pictures are superb. There are portraits of her from 1967 and 1970 that are among the best images of any 20th century royal, and he took them, in a house where they were not speaking, and she sat for him, and both of them turned up and did the work properly. Whatever else was true, they respected each other's competence. He thought she was a good subject, she thought he was a great photographer and said so, publicly, for the rest of her life, including after the divorce. She never once, on the record, said a word against his work. The second is that both of them were funny about it. There is a strain of extremely dark humor running through the accounts of that marriage, from people who were present, in which both parties made jokes about the state of it, sometimes to each other, and the jokes were good. That is a recognizable thing in a certain kind of English marriage, and it is not the same as affection, but it is not nothing either, and any account that presents Margaret purely as a victim in a locked room misses it. She fought back. She was capable of taking him apart in front of a table when she chose to, and she chose to. Anybody who has read Glenconner or Brown knows that Princess Margaret had a tongue that could remove paint, and that she used it on her husband as well as on everybody else. The difference, and this is why the marriage cannot be scored as a draw, is in the instruments. She was cutting in public, in the moment, in the ordinary currency of a bad marriage between 2 clever people. He wrote things down, in his own hand, and left them where she would be alone when she found them, and then went silent for a week. One of those is a fight. The other is a campaign. Now, the turn. Every biography of this marriage identifies a period somewhere between 1963 and 1965, when the temperature changed, and none of them can point to a single event that caused it, because there was not one. What there was instead was an accumulation, and the accumulation ran in about 4 directions at once. The first was the work. Tony had joined the Sunday Times magazine in 1962 as artistic advisor, and the job took him away constantly, and it was the making of him professionally, and Margaret could not come. Royal protocol did not permit the Queen's sister to accompany a magazine photographer to a psychiatric hospital in the Midlands. It barely permitted her to be photographed reading the magazine. So he had a life that ran on trains and aeroplanes and hotel rooms and assignments, and it was full of interesting people who were not royal, and she had a life that ran on engagements at which she cut ribbons, and the two lives touched at Kensington Palace in the evenings, and increasingly did not have very much to say to each other. The second was the family. Tony had married into an institution that had no idea what to do with him. He was not a courtier, so he had no function. He was not a royal, so he had no rank of his own beyond what had been handed down to make his son legitimate in the eyes of Debrets. He was not staff, so he could not be managed. He was a man of 33, with a serious career, who found himself, at Balmoral and at Sandringham, expected to stand about in the wet being agreeable to people who had privately decided he was a tradesman. He was also extremely good at revenge in that specific setting. Everybody who was there in the mid-60s describes the same thing, which is that Tony would be witty at the expense of the household, and the wit was accurate, and it made the younger members of the family laugh, and it terrified the older ones, and the terror was the point. The third was Margaret herself, and honesty requires this to be said plainly, rather than folded into sympathy. Margaret was difficult to live with, she was difficult to work for, and there are dozens of staff accounts confirming it. She kept impossible hours, going to bed at 3 and rising at 11, which meant the household worked 2 shifts to accommodate 1 woman. She drank steadily from lunchtime. She smoked between 60 and 80 cigarettes a day, through a holder, which is not an exaggeration, and which eventually cost her a lung. She could turn on a friend of 20 years for a misjudged remark and freeze them out for a year. She insisted, in social situations where nobody had raised the question, on the precise observance of her rank, and she did it most often with people who were fond of her, which is the behavior of someone testing whether the fondness is real. Anne Glenconner, who loved her, and who served her for something close to 30 years, does not pretend otherwise in her memoir. She describes the exhaustion of it alongside the affection, and the two things sit next to each other on the page without resolving, which is the most honest account anybody has given. So Tony had a difficult wife, that is true. The fourth thing is the one that makes the other 3 insufficient as an explanation, which is that Tony never stopped having affairs, and had never intended to. He did not stop during the engagement, when Camilla Fry was carrying his child. He did not stop during the honeymoon period of the marriage. He did not stop in the good years. The names that have been documented from the 60s and 70s include Lady Jacqueline Rufus Isaacs, the American journalist Pamela Collin, and Anne Hills, who we will come to properly, and who by that stage had already begun what became a 20-year arrangement. Beyond the named ones, there was a rotating population of studio assistants, colleagues, friends' wives, and occasionally friends' husbands. He treated fidelity the way most people treat a dress code, which is to say as something you observe when the right people are watching and disregard when they are not. Margaret, abandoned in her own house and humiliated in front of her own circle, eventually did the same. Her documented affairs include Anthony Barton, a Bordeaux wine producer who was an old friend of both of them and who was godfather to Sarah, which gives you a sense of how tightly wound that social world was. Robin Douglas Home, a pianist and nephew of the former Prime Minister, with whom she had a brief and intense involvement in 1967, and who took his own life the following year. And, from around 1973, Roddy Llewellyn. 2 people committing adultery inside an aristocratic marriage in that era was not remarkable. Whole swathes of the English upper class ran on precisely that arrangement, and had done for 200 years, and it produced a great many marriages that were cold and functional, and lasted until somebody died. What made this marriage different was not the affairs, It was what Tony did between them. The notes are the center of this story, and I want to handle them carefully, because they are the thing that turns a familiar tale of two unhappy people into something that historians have found genuinely difficult to write about with composure. The most famous one is quoted in De Courcy, in Craig Brown's Ma'am Darling, and in Glenn Connor's Lady in Waiting. 3 sources, 3 different authors, 3 different relationships to the subject, and the wording is identical in all of them. It read that she looked like a Jewish manicurist, and that he hated her, followed by a line offering it as a piece of honesty from him. The accounts differ on where she found it. One version places it in her glove drawer, another has it slipped between the pages of a book she was reading. That disagreement is worth stating because I told you at the start I would tell you where the record splits, and here it splits. What does not vary is the wording, and Snowdon never denied it, in a life during which he denied a number of other things. Look at what that object actually is. It is not something shouted. Tony did not shout. Multiple witnesses describe a man who never raised his voice, and there is no account anywhere of him striking his wife or losing control of himself in the way that a certain kind of violent husband does. The note required him to think of the phrase, to find paper, to write it out in his own hand, to fold it, to select a location she would go to alone, and to place it there and then walk away and continue his day knowing it was waiting. Then it required him to be in the house when she found it, and to say nothing. Glenn Connor records that there were others. She describes a list left where Margaret would come across it, headed with words to the effect of 24 reasons why I hate you, itemized. 24. Somebody sat down and got to 24. Beyond the written material, there was the technique that everybody who spent time in that apartment describes, which was the withdrawal. Tony would stop speaking to her, not for an evening, for days at a time, sometimes for a week or more. He would go into his study at Kensington Palace and close the door and communicate only through staff if he communicated at all, and then he would emerge and be entirely normal and never refer to it, and there was no way for her to know when it would start, or what had caused it, or when it would stop. If you want to understand why the notes and the silences were worse than the affairs, that is why. An affair is an injury. This was a system. It ran continuously, it was unpredictable by design, and it made the person on the receiving end of it responsible for monitoring the mood of somebody who had no intention of letting the monitoring succeed. Craig Brown, writing in 2017, used the word gaslighting, and he used it before the term had been worn out by overuse. His argument is that Tony understood Margaret's specific vulnerabilities with unusual precision: the loneliness, the lifelong sense of being the second one, the fear that she was ridiculous, the knowledge that the institution she had sacrificed Peter Townsend for did not particularly value her, and that he used every one of those things as an instrument. That is a strong claim, and Brown is a satirist by trade, so weigh it accordingly. But he is not the only person to arrive there. Glenn Connor, who is not a satirist and who was in the room, reached the same conclusion by observation over 3 decades, and her language in the memoir is harder than Brown's. She describes a man who appeared to take pleasure in it. Then there were the dinner parties, and these are the incidents that the largest number of independent witnesses saw with their own eyes. Tony was superb company. That has to be understood, or none of this makes sense. He was funny, he was interested in people, he told stories well, he made a table go. And in the middle of that performance he would turn to his wife and say something about her appearance, or her weight, or her age, or her intelligence, and it would be phrased as a joke, and it would land in front of 8 or 10 of their own friends, and the table would go quiet for a beat, and then somebody would rescue it. The joke construction is the cruelest part of the design. It makes the target responsible for her own reaction. If she absorbs it, the humiliation is complete. If she objects, she has no sense of humor and has spoiled the evening, and Tony gets to look put upon in front of witnesses who will remember it that way. There is an account, repeated in more than one memoir of that circle, of guests leaving a Kensington Palace dinner and standing on the pavement outside afterwards, not saying anything about what they had just watched, because there was nothing that could usefully be said. They kept going back. That is what people did. It was the Princess and the Earl, and you did not decline. By the late 1960s, Apartment 1A had stopped functioning as a house. The staff accounts of this period are the most vivid evidence in the whole story, precisely because the people giving them had no stake in the outcome. They were footmen and dressers and kitchen staff, and they wanted an ordinary working day, and they could not get one. There were routes. If the princess was in the drawing room, you went round. If the earl was working, that corridor was closed and you did not test it. There were times of day at which certain rooms were effectively unavailable. Messages between the two principal residents of the house were carried by staff who had to decide, in the moment, how to phrase a thing that had been said in anger so that it would not detonate at the other end, and who then had to carry the response back. One account describes a period during which the two of them communicated principally by note left on a hall table, and given what we know about what Tony put in notes, that arrangement carried a particular risk. They stopped sharing a bedroom. They stopped traveling together where the diary allowed it, and where the diary did not allow it, they traveled together and did not speak in the car. They developed the specific competence of the long-term hostile marriage, which is the ability to be photographed side by side looking pleasant, and to have said nothing to one another for 4 days. And 2 children were growing up inside it. David was born in 1961 and Sarah in 1964, which means that by 1970, when the household had fully hardened into its Cold War shape, they were 9 and 6. They were there. They were in that apartment, with those staff, walking those corridors, under those protocols. Both of them have declined, consistently, across their entire adult lives, to describe it in any detail. David Linley built a furniture business, and became, by common consent, one of the most private and least troublesome people ever to be born into proximity with that family. Sarah Chatto became a painter, and married an actor, and has given perhaps a handful of interviews in 50 years. When either of them has spoken about their parents, the language has been affectionate, brief, and constructed with visible care. That care is not evasion. It is the specific speech pattern of adults who have decided that the people involved are dead and that nothing is served by the rest of it. And it is one of the few genuinely honorable things in this entire narrative. There is one detail from the children's side of it that I think about more than the notes. Both David and Sarah have said, in different words at different times, that their father was fun, that he was the parent who made things, who took them places, who was interested in what they were doing. Tony was, by the evidence, a good father in the ordinary daily sense, while being a systematically cruel husband in the same building at the same time. That combination is harder to process than a straightforwardly bad man would be. It means the cruelty was not a temperament he could not control. It was a thing he did to a specific person, and he was capable of switching it off when he walked into a different room. Meanwhile, outside the house, both of their careers were doing the opposite of the marriage. Tony's reputation rose continuously through the 60s and 70s, the Sunday Times work, the portraits, the aviary opening in 1964, documentary commissions, awards. He was, by the middle of the decade, a genuine public figure in his own right, rather than an appendage, and he had achieved that in 5 years from a standing start, using access that his marriage had provided and talent that was entirely his own. Untangling those two contributions is impossible, and people have argued about the proportions ever since. Margaret's public standing went the other way, and it went the other way partly because of the same tabloid culture that Tony was helping to invent. She was photographed on holiday. She was photographed smoking. She was photographed with a drink in her hand at 4 in the afternoon on Mystique, on the private island where her friend Colin Tennant, Lord Glenconner, had given her a plot of land as a wedding present, and where she had built a house, called Les Joliot, with money and a design that were, ironically, contributed in part by her husband, who drew up the original plans. The public mood on Margaret curdled through the 1970s. She was the royal who did not work hard enough, cost too much, drank in the sun, and had a young man. Every one of those charges had some basis, and every one of them was applied to her in a way it was not applied to men in the same family doing similar things, and both of those statements are true simultaneously. Which brings us to 1973 and a 25-year-old landscape gardener at a house party in Scotland. Roddy Llewellyn was 25 years old in 1973. Princess Margaret was 43. He was the second son of Sir Harry Llewellyn, who had won a team gold medal in show jumping at the Helsinki Olympics on a horse called Foxhunter that was, for about a decade, one of the most famous animals in Britain. So Roddy came from a family that was well known, well connected, and not remotely grand in the way that the palace understood grandeur. He was training as a landscape gardener. He had almost no money. He was gentle, unassertive, faintly hopeless in the manner that some very charming young men are, and he had, by every account of everyone who met him, an entirely uncomplicated sweetness. They met at Cairnsmill, a house in Scotland, at a lunch arranged by Colin Tennant, who spent a great deal of his life arranging things for Margaret, and who was not always right about what she needed. On this occasion he was. I want to be careful about how I put the next part, because the tabloid version of this relationship was that a bored princess collected a toy boy, and that version is both cruel and lazy, and it was believed by millions of people for years. Here is what the people close to it actually describe. Margaret had spent 13 years married to a man who withheld affection as a matter of policy, who mocked her in front of her friends, and who wrote her notes telling her that he hated her. Roddy Llewellyn was kind to her. That is the whole thing. He was kind to her consistently, in private and in public, over a period of years, and he asked her for nothing, and he did not compete with her, and he did not require her to be a princess in order to justify his interest. She was 43 years old, and it was, on the available evidence, the first time in her adult life that anyone had treated her that way for a sustained period. The relationship lasted, in various forms, for around 8 years. He went to Mustique with her. He stayed at Les Jolies Eaux. He was absorbed into her circle. The Queen, who was informed of the situation and who tended to deal with her sister's private life by declining to have opinions about it in public, was reportedly kind to him on the occasions they met, which is a small detail that says a good deal about Elizabeth II. Tony knew. Of course he knew. Everybody in that world knew, and Tony was in that world professionally. And Tony waited. That is the part of 1973 to 1976 that gets skipped, and it should not be. For roughly 3 years, the Earl of Snowdon, who had been conducting his own affairs continuously since before the engagement, knew that his wife was involved with Roddy Llewellyn, and did nothing about it. He did not confront her, he did not leave, he did not seek a separation. He kept his position, kept his apartment at Kensington Palace, kept the professional standing that came with the connection, and waited for something to happen that he could use. In February 1976, it happened. A photograph appeared in the News of the World. It showed Princess Margaret and Roddy Llewellyn on the beach at Mustique, both in swimwear, sitting together. By any reasonable standard, it was an innocuous picture. It was 2 people on a beach in the sun. What made it detonate was the arithmetic that the newspaper printed alongside it, which was that she was 45 and he was 28, and that the taxpayer was funding the establishment that had produced the holiday. The British press in 1976 was entering the most aggressive phase in its history. Rupert Murdoch had owned the News of the World for 7 years and the Sun for 7 years. The circulation war between the popular papers was being fought with a ferocity that had no precedent, and royal material was the single most reliable weapon in it, and Margaret was the most exposed target in the family. The coverage that followed was savage, in a way that is hard to convey now. There were questions in Parliament about her civil list money. A Labour MP called for her to be removed from it entirely, describing her in terms that a member of the House would not have used about any other member of that family. Newspapers ran editorials about her cost, her working hours, her drinking, and her morals. Cartoonists had a very good month. And this is the moment at which her husband made his move. Tony had been abroad on assignment when the photograph ran. He came back into a situation in which his wife was the most publicly humiliated woman in Britain, in which she had no defenders in the press, in which the palace was scrambling, and in which any action he took would be read by the public as the reaction of a wronged man. He went to the palace and pushed for a formal separation. Read that sequence once more, with the chronology in the right order, because the chronology is the argument. Tony had been unfaithful from before the wedding day, continuously, for 16 years, including at least 1 child born to another woman during the marriage, and a mistress of long standing. Margaret had one relationship, conducted over 3 years, with a man who was kind to her. A newspaper photographed it, and her husband used that photograph as the instrument to end the marriage on terms that made him the injured party, at the precise moment when she had no public credit left to spend, and nothing at all to bargain with. Craig Brown's summary of this maneuver is the coldest sentence written about Snowdon by anybody, and it is difficult to argue with. Brown's position is that Tony rode Margaret's status to the career he wanted, spent her emotional resources over 16 years, and then disposed of her at the exact moment the tabloid era gave him a way to do it that could be presented as her fault. The separation was announced on the 19th of March, 1976. The public reaction split along a line that would have been predictable to anybody watching the press coverage. Tony was widely treated as a man who had endured a great deal. Margaret was treated as a woman who had brought it on herself. The interior of that marriage was known in detail to perhaps 30 people, none of whom were going to talk in 1976, and so the version that reached the country was the version the newspapers had already decided on. Glenn Connor's account of Margaret in that period is difficult reading. She describes a woman who had been publicly stripped, who had lost the argument before it started, and who understood perfectly well what her husband had just done to her, and had no means whatsoever of saying so. If you are still with me at this point, and I know this is a long one, take a second and hit subscribe and ring the bell. Comments 2. Tell me whether you think Tony had already decided how this was going to end when he stood in that abbey in 1960, or whether he made it up as he went along, because I go back and forth on it, and I would like to know what you think. Now, what happened between the separation in March 1976 and the divorce in July 1978 is instructive, because it shows how much this was about position rather than about wanting out. Tony moved out of Kensington Palace and took a house in Kensington. He kept working. His professional life, which had been built substantially on the access of the preceding 16 years, continued without interruption, and his reputation in the press was, if anything, improved by the separation. He was now the talented man who had survived a difficult royal marriage, which is a considerably better position than the one he had occupied as the Jones boy. Margaret's collapsed further. In the summer of 1976, she was ill, and the papers reported the illness in terms that made it a moral event. Roddy Llewellyn, who was 28 years old, and who had never in his life been prepared for anything remotely like the attention now directed at him, went to Turkey for a period, which the press covered as an abandonment. He came back. The divorce came through on the 11th of July 1978. The significance of that date is worth stating precisely, because the version you usually hear is slightly wrong in a way that undersells it. It is frequently said that this was the first divorce of a senior British royal since Henry VIII. It is more accurate to say since Princess Margaret Tudor, Henry's sister, in 1527, which is 451 years. Pedants will correctly point out that Queen Victoria's granddaughter, Princess Victoria Melita, was divorced in 1901. That is true, and it also happened at a considerable remove from the immediate British royal family, in Germany, involving a Grand Duke of Hesse, and it did not have to be managed by a palace press office in London. For the working, central, immediate royal family, the family whose members appear on the balcony, this was the first one in 4.5 centuries, and it happened to the woman who had been made to give up Peter Townsend in 1955, specifically because the Church of England could not countenance a royal marriage touched by divorce. I want that irony stated flatly rather than dressed up, because it does not need any help. She surrendered the man she loved at the age of 25, in a public statement invoking the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, in order to protect an institution from the taint of divorce. 23 years later, that same institution processed her own divorce from the man she married instead, and the world had changed enough by then that it cost the monarchy very little. She had paid the full price for a rule that was abandoned without ceremony inside her own lifetime. There is a detail about the settlement that people find revealing. Tony left the marriage with his career, his reputation, his professional archive, and his freedom. Margaret kept Les Jolies Eaux en Moustique, which had been given to her as land by Colin Tennant, and built with a house that Tony had helped design, and which became the thing the newspapers used against her for the rest of her life. She kept the ring, too. She wore her wedding ring until she died. 5 months after the decree absolute, on the 15th of December 1978, Snowdon married Lucy Lindsay Hogg. 5 months. The divorce that had taken 451 years to arrive was followed within 22 weeks by a wedding. Lucy was 27, Tony was 48. She was a film researcher, the daughter of a baronet, and she had until recently been married to the film and television director Michael Lindsay Hogg, who had directed The Beatles in Let It Be and a great deal else, and whose own paternity was the subject of one of the more persistent rumours in British public life, though that is another story entirely. Their daughter, Lady Frances Armstrong-Jones, was born in July 1979. If you are wondering whether the second marriage was the corrected version, whether age had done anything, whether Lucy got a different man from the one Margaret got, I can tell you now that she did not, and that the mechanism by which she found out was worse than anything in the first marriage. But before we get there, we need to talk about Anne Hills, because she had been there the entire time. Anne Hills was a journalist, and she was good at it. She wrote on archaeology and heritage and travel, she worked for a range of publications over a long career, and the people who knew her professionally described somebody capable, curious, and funny in the dry way of people who have spent their lives around deadlines. She was not a decorative woman brought in to sit somewhere and look at a photographer. She had her own work and her own standing. She met Antony Armstrong-Jones in the 1970s, and she remained his mistress, on and off, for approximately 20 years. 20 years. Consider the timeline that sits alongside. That relationship began while he was married to Princess Margaret at Kensington Palace. It survived the Mystique photograph and the separation and the divorce. It survived his marriage to Lucy Lindsay Hogg in 1978. It survived the birth of his daughter Frances in 1979, and it was still going in the 1990s. It ran underneath the entire public architecture of his life, like a second set of foundations. She was not a fling. A fling is an event. This was a fixed feature, sustained across 2 decades and 2 marriages, and the sustaining required continuous effort on both sides. What her friends have said about her position is consistent, and it is difficult to read. She understood exactly what she was, and she had understood it for a very long time. She was the woman he would not leave a wife for, and she had watched him not leave 2 of them. She was in her 50s by the 1990s, and she had spent the largest part of her adult life waiting for a decision that a man had made 20 years earlier without telling her. She was also, in the last year of her life, reportedly aware that he had begun something new. We will come to that in a moment. The chronology of what she knew and when is not fully documented, and I am not going to build a case on it. But the outline is that by 1996, she had reason to believe that after 20 years, she had been superseded by somebody in her 20s. On the 31st of December 1996, New Year's Eve, Anne Hills took her own life. She went to the roof of the building where she lived in Highgate, and she died there. She was 57 years old. Snowdon was informed that evening. He then went to the New Year's Eve party he had been intending to attend. I said at the start of this that when we reached her I would give you the sequence and then get out of the way, and that is what I am going to do. She was in his life for 20 years. She died on New Year's Eve. He was told. He went to the party. There is no version of this in which somebody misunderstood a message, or in which he did not know, or in which the party was an obligation he could not escape. He was 66 years old and a peer of the House of Lords, and there was nobody in Britain who could have compelled him to attend a party on the 31st of December 1996. The thing I find myself returning to is not the callousness, because callousness on its own is common and stupid and everywhere. It is the composure. Whatever it takes to put on evening dress and go out and be entertaining company for 4 hours on the night you are told that a woman who loved you for 20 years has thrown herself off a roof. He had it, and he had it available immediately, without preparation. That capacity is the same capacity that wrote the note about the manicurist and then sat down to dinner. It is the same capacity that went silent for 8 days in Kensington Palace, and then came out and was charming to a photographer on the pavement. Whatever the mechanism was that let him do that, it was installed early, and it never failed him. Some people who knew him have argued that it was damage rather than coldness, that the boy in the Liverpool ward learned to seal a door in himself and never learned how to open it again, and that what looks from outside like cruelty was in fact an absence, a room where a response should have been, and was not. That reading has real sympathy in it, and it may be true. It is also worth noticing what the reading does, which is to convert a series of choices into a condition. He chose to write the note. He chose the location. He chose to go to the party. A man who is unable to feel something is not thereby unable to decline an invitation. I said I would let you decide, and I am going to hold to that. What I will not do is skip past her, because she is the person in this story who has been skipped past most consistently, and she was somebody's friend and somebody's colleague, and she was in that man's life for 2 decades, and the reason her name does not appear in most accounts of Snowdon is that she was not royal and therefore was not considered to be part of the plot. The coroner recorded her death. The papers reported it briefly. Snowdon's biographers have handled it with varying degrees of directness, and De Courcy, to her credit, does not soften it in the authorized book. Roughly a year later, Snowdon began the relationship that ended his second marriage. Melanie Cable Alexander was an editor at Country Life magazine. She was in her early 30s. He was 67. She became pregnant, and on the 30th of April 1998, she gave birth to a son. His name is Jasper Cable Alexander. Now there is a detail in how this came out that is worth pausing on, because it is the one moment in this entire story when the machinery of tabloid Britain that Snowdon had helped to bring into being turned round and pointed at him. The birth reached the newspapers. It was not managed, it was not announced, it was not handled by anybody's press office. It was reported, in the way that Margaret's holiday in 1976 had been reported, by papers that had worked out that a private life could be printed if it was interesting enough, and the subject could not stop you. Which meant that Lucy Lindsay Hogg, who had been married to him for 19 years and who was the mother of his daughter, found out that her husband had fathered a child with a woman in her 30s by the same route as everybody else in the country. She filed for divorce. It was finalized in 2000. There is a symmetry there that Snowdon can hardly have failed to notice. In 1976, he had used a newspaper photograph of his wife on a beach to engineer a separation on his own terms. 22 years later, a newspaper printed the fact of his son by another woman, and his second wife ended their marriage on hers. He had spent his professional life on the inside of that industry. He had helped invent the appetite. In 1998, it ate him, and it is the only occasion in 9 decades on which the record shows him losing anything he had not chosen to give up. Let me set out the ledger on Antony Armstrong-Jones, as it stood at the age of 70, in the year 2000. 2 marriages, both ended by his own conduct. 3 children born inside those marriages, David and Sarah with Margaret, Francis with Lucy. 1 daughter, Polly, conceived with his best friend's wife during his engagement to a princess and born 3 weeks after his wedding, raised by another man, unacknowledged for 44 years. 1 son, Jasper, conceived during his second marriage with a woman 37 years his junior, whose birth ended that marriage. 1 mistress of 20 years standing who took her own life, and an uncountable number of other relationships, some documented, most not, running continuously from his 20s into his 60s, without a single sustained interruption. In 1999, the House of Lords Act removed the great majority of hereditary peers from the chamber. Snowdon's earldom was hereditary, so under the Act he would have lost his seat. On the 16th of November 1999, he was created a life peer as Baron Armstrong-Jones, of Nymans, in the county of West Sussex, specifically so that he could remain in the House of Lords. And the reason it was done, the reason that was given at the time, and that everybody involved accepted, was that he had work in that chamber that would not otherwise get done. He had spent decades on disability legislation, and disability access, and the practical mechanics of how a disabled person moves through a British city, and he was one of the very few peers who cared about it, and by some distance the most effective. So in the same 12-month period, during which his second wife divorced him over a child by another woman, Parliament arranged a special dispensation to keep him in the legislature because his advocacy for disabled people was too valuable to lose. Both of those things are true. Neither cancels the other. That is going to keep happening for the rest of this story, and I would rather you were prepared for it than surprised each time. Margaret's last 24 years are the part of this story that almost nobody tells, because there is no plot in them. There is only a woman getting smaller. She was 47 when the divorce came through. In 1978, she lived to be 71. That is nearly a quarter of a century after the marriage ended, which is longer than the marriage lasted, and the shape of it was set within about 2 years. Roddy Llewellyn stayed in her life until 1981. He was 33 that year, and he married Tatiana Soskin, a woman his own age, and he told Margaret before he told the papers, and she was reportedly generous about it, in a way that cost her something. They remained friends. He continued to visit. When she was dying, he was among the people who came. That was, on the record, the last romantic relationship of her life. She was 51 years old. She had 20 years left, and she spent them in a pattern that is documented in exhausting detail because she was one of the most surveilled women in Britain, and every element of it was reported. The winters, or parts of them, on Mystique at Les Jolis Eaux. The house was small by the standards you would imagine, 5 bedrooms on a promontory, and she loved it with a fierceness that had a great deal to do with the fact that it was hers. Nobody in that family had given it to her. It came from Colin Tennant, and she had built on it herself, and it was the only place on earth where she could sit outside, in a swimsuit, with a drink, and be neither the Queen's sister nor a line item in the civil list. The papers punished her for it every single year. There was a standing arrangement in Fleet Street, whereby the Mystique trip generated at least one story about cost, and at least one about idleness, and she knew the stories were coming, and she went anyway, which I have some respect for. The rest of the year was Kensington Palace, apartment 1A, the same 20 rooms she had shared with Tony, now occupied by one woman, her staff, and the accumulated furniture of a marriage. She worked. That is another thing that gets dropped from the caricature. She was patron or president of something in the region of 80 organizations, and she did the engagements, unglamorous ones, in the rain, in provincial towns, for decades. The Royal Ballet, which she genuinely knew about and genuinely cared about. The NSPCC, the Girl Guides, hospitals, regiments. Nobody wrote about a Princess Margaret hospital visit because it was not a story, and the accumulated tonnage of those unreported afternoons across 40 years was substantial. That imbalance deserves a moment, because it is the single most persistent unfairness in how she has been remembered, and it is measurable rather than a matter of opinion. Her annual engagement count through the 1970s and 80s ran to a figure in the low hundreds. Not the highest in the family, nowhere near the lowest either. She did more official work in most years than several relatives who have never been described in print as idle, and she did it while being the only member of the family whose civil list allocation was subject to an annual parliamentary campaign specifically directed at her. The campaign had a name attached to it. Willie Hamilton, the Labour member for West Fife, made royal finance his subject for over 20 years, and Margaret was his preferred illustration of the argument. He called her, in the House and in print, expensive and idle, and he used considerably harsher formulations than that, and the coverage of his interventions was substantial, because the newspapers had worked out that they sold. The mechanics of why she was the target, rather than anybody else, are not mysterious. She had no constitutional function, so there was no dignity to be violated by attacking her. She had a visible private life, which gave the attack something to hang on. She holidayed somewhere warm and photogenic. She was a woman, and the specific charges leveled at her, the drinking and the young man, and the cost of her clothes, were charges that were not leveled at men in that family who were doing all three. And there was the Mystique problem, which was structural, and which she could not solve. The island was hers in the sense that mattered emotionally, and it was privately owned in the sense that mattered legally, and she went there in January and February most years, and every single trip generated a story about public money, even though the house had been built with her own, and the land had been a gift. The reporting rarely made the distinction. The distinction was not what the story was for. What she actually did in those unreported afternoons is worth a sentence, because some of it was substantial. She was president of the Royal Ballet from 1957, and in that role she was not decorative. She knew the repertoire, she knew the dancers, she attended rehearsals rather than only galas, and people inside that company have said consistently over decades that her involvement was informed and useful, and that she used her position to protect their funding when it needed protecting. She was president of the NSPCC for something over 40 years. She was patron of the Invalid Children's Aid Association, and of Barnardo's, and of the Scottish Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, and of dozens of hospitals and regiments and local charities that got a visit from a member of the royal family because she turned up. None of that is a defense of her behavior toward the people who worked for her, which was frequently indefensible, and which I have already set out. Two things can be true. She could make a footman's life miserable at 11 at night and open a pediatric ward properly at 10 the next morning, and the ward staff would go home saying she had been marvelous, and the footman would go home saying nothing because he needed the job. The reason I am laboring this is that the caricature of Margaret as a useless woman who drank in the sun has done real work in this story, and the work it did was to make what her husband did to her less legible. If she was ridiculous, then a husband who told her she was ridiculous was merely rude. If she was idle and expensive, then a husband who tired of her was understandable. The public version of Margaret that Fleet Street constructed across the 1970s was, whether anybody intended it or not, the character reference that Tony's conduct required in order to pass without comment. He did not build that version. He did not have to. He simply lived inside a decade in which it was being built for him by other people, and in 1976 he stepped out onto it and it held his weight. She was also, by the 1980s, unwell in ways that were the direct and predictable result of how she had lived. She had smoked since she was a teenager, up to 60 or 80 a day at the peak, always through a holder, which had become so much a part of her public image that cartoonists could draw her with 3 lines and the holder. In January 1985, she had part of her left lung removed at the Brompton Hospital. She was 54. The lesion was benign, which was the outcome everybody had been dreading against, and the operation was widely reported as a warning she had been given and heeded. She had not heeded it. She resumed smoking, though at a reduced rate, and she continued drinking, and both of those facts were public, because everything about her was public. In 1998, on Mystique, she had a stroke. It was described as mild at the time. She recovered function and she went back to work within months, and the palace line was that she was fine. In February 1999, in the bathroom of the house on Mystique, she scalded her feet very badly. The circumstances were reported in several conflicting versions at the time, and the detail was never fully clarified. What is not in dispute is the severity. The burns were serious enough to require months of treatment. They impaired her mobility permanently, and from that point, she used a wheelchair for the majority of her public appearances. Look at the arithmetic of that injury against the rest of her life for a moment. She was 68. She had spent 40 years being photographed and having her appearance dissected in print, and now she was going to appear in public in a wheelchair, wearing dark glasses because her eyesight had been affected, in front of the same photographers. She kept going for a while. She appeared at the Queen Mother's 99th and 100th birthday events. The photographs from those appearances circulated widely, and they were extremely hard to look at, and a certain amount of the coverage was unkind about them, in ways that people who write for newspapers should be ashamed of, and were not. Further strokes followed in 2001. She lost mobility on her left side. She lost a substantial part of her sight. She largely withdrew from public life. There is an image from that final stretch that I think is the truest thing about her. In her bedroom at Kensington Palace, until the end, there was a framed photograph of Group Captain Peter Townsend. She had been made to give him up in 1955, at the age of 25, to protect the Church of England's position on the indissolubility of marriage. She had married a man 5 years later who spent 16 years telling her she was ridiculous. She had been divorced in 1978, which was the very thing she had sacrificed Townsend to prevent. She had spent 24 years alone afterwards, and the photograph on the table was of the man from 1955. Townsend himself died in 1995, in France. Married to Marie Luce for 36 years, he wrote a memoir in 1978 called Time and Chance, in which he handled the whole episode with a restraint that reads, "At this distance, as a form of protection." Princess Margaret died at 6:30 in the morning on the 9th of February 2002 at King Edward VII Hospital in London, after a final stroke and cardiac problems. She was 71. David and Sarah were with her. She was cremated at Slough, which was unusual for a member of that family, and was done at her own request, and her ashes were placed in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor, beside her father, beside the man who had adored her and indulged her and given her permission and no purpose. Her mother outlived her by 7 weeks. The Queen Mother died on the 30th of March, 2002, at the age of 101, and the 2 funerals, inside 2 months, brought a particular era of that family to a close, in a manner that felt, at the time, unmistakably final. She wore her wedding ring until she died. Consider what that means alongside everything on the record, because I have thought about it a good deal, and I do not have a tidy account of it. She kept the ring given to her by a man who left handwritten notes telling her she disgusted him. She also kept the photograph of the man she had not been allowed to marry. Both objects were in her rooms at the same time, for 24 years, and she looked at both of them, and there is no interpretation of that which makes her into a simple figure. Snowdon attended her funeral. He was 71, and by that stage, using a stick, he was photographed arriving. He gave, over the following years, a small number of remarks about her, and they were affectionate and imprecise, and revealed nothing whatsoever. He never wrote about the marriage. When de Courcy interviewed him at length for the authorized biography, he cooperated fully, gave her access to his papers, permitted her to publish material about his affairs and his cruelty that no other subject of an authorized biography has permitted, and declined throughout to offer any explanation of it. That combination is remarkable, and I want to name it clearly. He did not deny, he did not justify, he did not present a version in which he was misunderstood. He handed a biographer the material and let her draw the conclusion, and the conclusion is devastating, and he read it and made no complaint. A number of people have taken that as a form of confession. I think it may be something a little different. I think it is possible that Antony Armstrong-Jones had genuinely stopped caring, by his late 70s, what anybody thought of him as a husband, and that he retained a very keen interest indeed in what they thought of him as a photographer, and that the ordering of those 2 priorities was the most honest statement he ever made about himself. Which brings us to the work, and to the part of this that people who dislike him find inconvenient and which cannot be left out. In February 1962, the Sunday Times published the first colour supplement in the history of British newspapers, and Antony Armstrong-Jones was its artistic advisor. You have to understand what that object was in order to understand what he did with it. Nobody had done it before. A free colour magazine, printed on good paper, delivered inside a broadsheet newspaper to something over 1 million households every Sunday morning. The commercial logic was advertising, because colour advertising commanded rates that black and white did not. The editorial logic did not exist yet. Nobody knew what a colour supplement was for, and the men who ran it had to invent it in real time, and the man they had appointed to advise them on how it should look was a 31-year-old society photographer who had married the Queen's sister 18 months earlier and who had no journalistic experience whatsoever. What he did with it changed British photojournalism, and this is not a claim invented by his admirers. It is the settled view of people who study the history of the medium. The conventional use of colour in 1962 was for pleasant things. Colour was for fashion, for food, for travel, for the royal family, for advertising. Colour was expensive, and therefore colour was reserved for material that flattered. Snowdon sent photographers into psychiatric hospitals. He commissioned work on the back-to-back housing of the industrial north, on mining communities, on the elderly poor, on the residents of long-stay mental institutions, who at that point in Britain were kept in conditions that the country had collectively agreed not to look at, and it ran, in colour, at that size, on the reproduction quality that only advertising had previously commanded, into the homes of middle-class families in the home counties, on a Sunday morning, between the fashion pages and the motoring column. The decision to use colour on poverty was the whole intervention. Black and white had, by 1962, become the visual language of social documentary, and in becoming a language, it had become a genre, and in becoming a genre, it had become something a reader could recognize and turn past. Grim photographs of the poor in black and white were a category. Everybody knew what they were. Nobody was disturbed by them any longer. Colour was the language of desire. Colour was what you used to make somebody want a car. Putting a psychiatric ward in color on that paper stock removed the protective distance, and readers complained, and the complaints were the evidence that it had worked. He photographed a great deal of it himself. He also had the sense, which is rarer than talent, to commission people better than him for specific jobs and then leave them alone. His own portrait work from that decade, and the one after, is in the National Portrait Gallery, and there are a great many of them, and they have a quality that is easy to feel and hard to describe. The Olivier sittings, Vivian Leigh. The David Bowie studies from the 1970s, which are among the best photographs of Bowie that anybody took, and Bowie was photographed by everybody. Diana Rigg, Alec Guinness, Barbara Cartland, absurd and magnificent. Hundreds of others. What they have in common is that the subject is never composed. Every one of them looks as though they have just this second finished saying something, and are waiting to see whether you were paying attention, and are slightly amused about it. That is a very specific effect, and it does not happen by accident. It happens because the man behind the camera was, for the 20 minutes that the sitting lasted, giving somebody the most complete and flattering attention they had ever received, and photographing the moment when they relaxed into it. Which is to say that the thing he was professionally best at in the world was making a person feel seen. Hold that against the interior of his marriage for a moment. He possessed, at an extremely high level, the exact capacity whose absence destroyed his wife. He could produce it on demand for a stranger in a studio for 20 minutes, and he could not, or would not, produce it at home, and I do not think there is any way to make that comfortable. Then there is the aviary. In 1964, London Zoo opened a new aviary in Regent's Park, designed by Snowdon, in collaboration with the architect Cedric Price and the structural engineer Frank Newby. If you have walked along the towpath of the Regent's Canal, you have seen it. It is an enormous angular thing in tension steel and aluminium, held up by a system of struts and cables, rather than by conventional framing, and it was the first walk-through aviary in Britain, meaning that visitors go inside it and the birds fly around them. It is a genuinely significant piece of 1960s British architecture. It is Grade 2 star listed. It was restored at considerable expense between 2019 and 2021, and is now home to a colony of northern bald ibis. And it was conceived by a man who failed his second-year architecture examinations at Cambridge and never completed the degree. I would flag the honest caveat, which is that Price and Newby were serious professionals, and the engineering of that structure is Newby's achievement. The concept, the ambition, and a substantial part of the design language are documented as Snowdon's, and Price and Newby both said so at the time and afterwards, and neither of them had any reason to be generous to him. He made films. Don't Count the Candles, broadcast in 1968, was a documentary about growing old, and it won 2 Emmy Awards. Born to be Small, in 1971, was about people of restricted growth, and it won a further award. He made Happy Being Happy, and Peter, Portrait of a Painter, and others. The subjects tell you something: old age, disability, people whose bodies placed them outside what British television in 1968 was willing to show. He went back to that territory again and again over 30 years, and he went back to it with a directness and an absence of pity that was extremely unusual for the period, and that the participants consistently praised. And then there is the disability work, which is where this gets genuinely difficult. Snowdon had polio at 16, he walked with a limp for 70 years, and in the last decade of his life, he used a wheelchair. He knew, from the inside and continuously, what it was to move through a country that had been designed by people who assumed everybody could climb a step. He did not treat that as a private matter. He designed a powered platform for wheelchair users, which was produced and called the Chairmobile. He chaired a working party on the integration of disabled people that reported in 1976, which came to be known as the Snowdon Report, and which is a real document with real recommendations that fed into real policy. He was president of the Disability Rights Commission's predecessor bodies, he was involved with the Attlee Memorial Foundation's work in the area, and he founded and funded a fellowship scheme, the Snowdon Trust, which gives grants to disabled students in higher education, and which is still operating and has supported some thousands of people. His maiden speech in the House of Lords was about disabled people. He returned to the subject in that chamber for 4 decades. When the House of Lords Act of 1999 would have removed him, a life peerage was created so that he could stay and continue it, and the justification offered was the work. Everybody who has looked at this closely, including the people most hostile to him, has reached the same finding, which is that none of it was performance. There was no publicity advantage in disability policy in 1976. There was no fashionable cause to attach himself to. It was slow, technical, unrewarding committee work about ramps and grants and lavatory dimensions, and he did it for 40 years, and the people it helped will mostly never have known his name. So set the 2 columns side by side and look at them, which is what I have been asking you to do since the beginning, and which I am now going to stop deferring. In one column, a man who reinvented British photojournalism, whose portraits are in the National Collection, who co-designed a listed building, who won Emmys for documentaries about the old and the small, and who spent 4 decades of genuine political effort improving the material conditions of disabled British people at a moment when almost nobody in public life would touch the subject. In the other column, a man who married a woman while concealing a pregnant mistress, who was unfaithful continuously through 2 marriages, who wrote his wife a note telling her she looked like a Jewish manicurist and that he hated her, who itemized 24 reasons for hating her, who withdrew into silence for days at a time as a method of control, who humiliated her in front of her friends as a form of entertainment, who used a newspaper photograph of her to end the marriage on his own terms at the moment of her maximum public exposure, and who went to a party on the night he learned that a woman who had loved him for 20 years had killed herself. Same man, one nervous system, often the same week. And there is one more item for the first column that I have been holding back, because it belongs here rather than earlier. The photographs of Margaret are his. The definitive images of Princess Margaret, the ones that appear in every book and every documentary and every retrospective, the ones that will represent her for as long as anybody is interested in the 20th century, were taken by the man who wrote her the note. He photographed her from 1958 until the 1970s, through the courtship and the good years and the war years in Kensington Palace, and he was better at it than anybody else who ever pointed a camera at her. Which means the face that history sees when it thinks about her is a face he chose, lit, and framed. Her public image, the tilt of the chin and the cigarette holder, and the extraordinary eyes, was substantially constructed by the person who did the most damage to the woman behind it. I do not have anything clever to say about that. It is simply the situation, and it is the most complete illustration available of why this man cannot be filed and put away. And here is the part that people find hardest, so I am going to say it slowly. The work does not redeem the conduct. It also does not stop being real. The aviary is still standing in Regent's Park with the ibis flying about inside it. The Snowdon Trust is still giving grants to disabled students this year. Those things exist, and they are good, and they were made by him, and nothing that happened in apartment 1A at Kensington Palace makes them not exist. That is not a comfortable position to end up in. It is where the evidence puts you. In 2004, a woman of 44 named Polly Fry learned from a laboratory that her father was Lord Snowdon. I want to slow down here, because this is the one strand of the story where a person who had made no choices at all absorbed the whole cost of somebody else's, and it is routinely reported in a single sentence as a piece of trivia about Snowdon, rather than as an event that happened to a living woman. Consider what she had. Before the test, she had a father. Jeremy Fry had raised her from birth. He was an inventor and an engineer of real distinction, one of the founders of the company that became Rotork, a man who restored a house in Somerset and filled it with music and interesting people, and who was, by all accounts of everybody who knew that household, a good and generous father to his children. She had grown up inside that, understanding herself as a Fry, one of a family, with a father whose face she recognized in her own. And she had grown up, at the same time, in a social world in which a rumor circulated about her. Not printed, never printed, simply present, at dinner tables and in country houses, from the 1960s onward, in the specific manner of upper-class English gossip, which is that a thing is known by 400 people and said aloud to nobody who might be hurt by it. She would have felt the shape of it long before she knew the content. People do. A conversation changes tempo when you enter the room. Somebody looks at you a half-second longer than the remark warranted. You are 12, or 20, or 35, and you have the persistent sense that there is a fact about you in general circulation that you have not been given. The rumor had a mathematical basis, and anybody could do the arithmetic. Polly was born on the 28th of May 1960. Antony Armstrong-Jones married Princess Margaret on the 6th of May 1960. He had been an intimate friend of both her parents for years. The two dates sat 22 days apart in every reference book, and the friendship was documented in photographs. In 2004, the DNA test was taken, and it confirmed it. Snowdon acknowledged her. She was reported at the time to have handled it with a great deal of grace, and by the accounts of people who knew her, she did. Her stated position afterwards was that Jeremy Fry was her father, in the sense of the word that matters, and that a biological fact did not alter 44 years of being raised by somebody. Jeremy Fry never commented publicly, not once. He had known, presumably, for a very long time. He had raised the child of his closest friend and his own wife, and he had done it properly, and when the laboratory made it official, he said nothing whatsoever to any newspaper, and he died in 2005, a year later. I have thought about Jeremy Fry more than is probably reasonable while working on this. He is the person in this entire account with the strongest claim to have behaved well, and he is the one nobody discusses. He was betrayed by his best friend and his wife simultaneously, in the most consequential way available, and his response was to raise the resulting child as his own for 4 decades, and to decline, permanently, to make a public matter of it. Camilla Fry, for her part, had carried the whole thing since 1960. She and Jeremy divorced eventually. She lived a long life. What it cost her to sit through 44 years of a rumor about her own daughter is not documented, and it is not my business to invent it, but it cannot have been small. Now here is the detail from 2004 that I keep returning to, and it is the detail that tells you where Snowdon's priorities sat right to the end. The acknowledgement happened. It was reported. And then, when Snowdon died 13 years later, and there was a funeral at St. Bartholomew's Church in Kensington, and David spoke, and Sarah was there, and Francis was there, and Jasper was there, Polly Fry was not part of the official proceedings. His eldest child, confirmed by DNA, acknowledged by him in his own lifetime, and absent from the order of service. She was 56 years old that January. She had been his daughter for 13 years officially, and 56 actually. There is a version of this story in which that omission is administrative, the product of a funeral, organized by other people under pressure, with the conventional list in front of them, and that version may well be correct. There is another version in which it is exactly consistent with 60 years of conduct in which people were included when they were useful, and edited out when they were not, and in which a man who had built his professional life on deciding what appears inside a frame made one final decision about a frame. Take whichever you find more plausible. I know which way the weight of the evidence leans, and I am not going to make the argument for you. What all of this produced, taken together, is a set of 5 children by 4 different women across 4 decades, of whom 2 grew up inside a marriage that had become a system of psychological warfare. 1 grew up in a second marriage that ended when a newspaper printed the existence of the 5th. 1 grew up being raised by another man under a rumor, and 1 was born when his father was 67. Every one of them has, as adults, conducted themselves with more restraint about it than the situation required. That restraint is the most consistent theme in the second half of this story, and it deserves examining, because it is not the natural outcome. The natural outcome, in a British family with that quantity of documented material and that level of public interest, is a memoir. There were fortunes available. Any one of Snowdon's children could have written a book at any point in the last 30 years and named their own price. None of them did. Which brings us to David and Sarah, who grew up in apartment 1A while it was happening, and who have spent their entire adult lives declining to describe it. David Armstrong-Jones was born in 1961, which means he was 14 when his parents separated and 16 when they divorced. Sarah was born in 1964, so she was 11 and 13. Those are the worst possible ages for it. Old enough to understand everything, and young enough to have no means of leaving. They were at boarding school for much of it, which was standard for their class, and which in this instance was probably a mercy. David went to Bedales, which was a slightly unconventional choice, progressive and co-educational, and not the sort of place a viscount was automatically sent, and it is documented that his father chose it deliberately, and that his father was right. Sarah went to Bedales too. At Bedales, David discovered woodwork. He left school and trained at Parnham House in Dorset, under John Makepeace, which was at that time the most serious furniture school in the country, and he trained properly, as a craftsman, with tools, for years. In 1985 he founded a furniture company under his own name, and he has run it ever since. He makes marquetry, veneered pieces, commissioned work of considerable technical difficulty, and the trade regards it as legitimate. That is not a small achievement for a man who could have spent his entire life opening things. He also worked at Christie's as a chairman for over a decade, married Serena Stanhope in 1993, had 2 children, and became the second Earl of Snowdon on his father's death. He has given interviews about furniture. He has given almost none about anything else, and when the subject of his parents has been raised in the room, he has moved past it with a courtesy that is entirely impenetrable. Sarah became a painter, which she trained for at Camberwell and the Royal Academy schools, and she paints seriously, and exhibits, and sells, and the work is good, and it is quiet, and it is nothing whatever to do with being a member of the royal family. In 1994 she married the actor Daniel Chatto, and the marriage has lasted, and they have 2 sons, and she has spent 30 years constructing a life of a specific and deliberate obscurity. She is also, by consistent report from everybody around that family, one of the most liked people in it. She was very close to the late Queen. She was with her mother when she died. Here is what I notice about the 2 of them, and it is a pattern rather than a proof. Both of them make things with their hands. One works wood and the other works paint, and both of them chose a craft that requires long solitary hours, exact attention, and physical materials, and in which the work is either right or wrong by a standard that has nothing to do with what anybody says about you. Both of them married in their late 20s or early 30s, once, and stayed married. Both of them have declined, over 40 years and against enormous financial incentive, to describe their parents' marriage. You can read that as inheritance in the good sense. Their father was a maker, a man who was happiest with an object in front of him and a problem to solve in it, and he passed that on to both of them, and it is the best thing he gave them, and possibly the best thing he had. You can also read it as a decision, taken young and maintained for life, about what they were not going to be. A marriage that lasts is not an accident when you grew up watching the other kind at close range. Neither is a determination to say nothing. There is one small documented moment I want to put in, because it is the only glimpse we have from inside. Both David and Sarah have said, in different interviews across the decades, that their father was fun, that he made things with them, that he was the parent who arrived with an idea and a box of materials, who took them out on the boat, who was interested in what a child was actually doing rather than performing an interest in it. He was a good father. In the daily and practical sense in which children experience a parent, by the testimony of both children, Antony Armstrong-Jones was a good father and they loved him. And he was, in the same house, in the same years, sometimes in the same afternoon, systematically dismantling their mother. I said earlier that this is harder to process than a straightforwardly cruel man would be, and I want to explain why, because I think it is the single most important thing in this entire account. If Tony had been cruel to everybody, the story would be simple. It would be a story about a man with a defect, and defects are involuntary, and you file the person under damaged and you move on. Nobody stays angry at a broken instrument. He was not cruel to everybody. He was warm to his children. He was generous to young photographers, and there is a substantial body of testimony on that. Assistants he trained who went on to careers and who speak about him with real gratitude. He was kind, by numerous accounts, to strangers with disabilities who approached him, and he answered their letters, and some of those letters have survived, and they are not the letters of a cold man. He was courteous to staff, mostly. He was a good friend to a number of people over long periods, which means the cruelty was not a temperature he could not regulate. It was aimed. It had a target, and the target was the woman he was married to, and he could switch it off to walk into the nursery and switch it back on when he came out. That is the finding, and there is no interpretation available that makes it kinder. A man who cannot control himself is one kind of problem. A man who controls himself precisely and directs the result at one specific person for 16 years is another kind entirely. Why her then? That is the question everybody arrives at and nobody has answered, and I am not going to pretend to. The theories are these, and I will give you all of them and my honest assessment of each. The first is the Liverpool theory, which is the biographer's consensus. He was abandoned by a woman he needed at 16, and he spent the rest of his life ensuring that he would be the one to inflict abandonment rather than receive it, and the woman he married bore the whole weight of a debt owed by his mother. This has real explanatory power. It also has the weakness of all such theories, which is that it is unfalsifiable, and it arrives after the fact, and it does not explain why he could be warm to Susan, his sister, who nursed him, or to his daughters. The second is the institutional theory. He married into a family that treated him as staff, called him the Jones boy behind his hand, and gave him no function and no standing, and he could not attack the institution because the institution was made of protocol and silence, and so he attacked the one part of it that was in the house with him. Margaret was the monarchy, in the form he could reach. I find this one persuasive up to a point, and it fails on a date. The engagement was in February 1960, and Camilla Fry was already pregnant, which means the pattern predates the marriage entirely. He was not made cruel by the palace. He arrived that way, and the palace gave him somewhere to put it. The third is the simplest and least satisfying, which is that she was available. She was in the house. She was famous, and therefore hurting her had scale. She was lonely and had already been publicly broken once, which meant the material was there and it was reliable. And she could not leave, because a princess in 1965 did not leave, and he knew that on the day he married her. That third one is the one I keep coming back to, and I dislike it, because it removes the psychology entirely and leaves you with a man who did it because he could and because there was no cost. Take whichever you prefer. The record supports all three unevenly and none completely. What the record supports absolutely is the conduct, and by the end of the 1990s, the man who had done it was 70 years old, and his own body was beginning to come for him. Post-polio syndrome is one of the more cruel arrangements in medicine, and it works like this. When the polio virus destroys motor neurons, the surviving neurons compensate. They sprout new connections and take over the work of the ones that died, so a muscle that has lost most of its nerve supply can still be driven by what remains. That compensation is why a great many polio survivors walked and worked and lived ordinary physical lives for decades. The compensation has a cost, and the bill arrives 30 or 40 years later. The overworked neurons begin to fail. Muscles that had been holding for half a century start to give way. Fatigue becomes overwhelming and disproportionate. Pain arrives in joints that have spent 50 years bearing loads at the wrong angle. Snowdon had polio at 16, in 1946. He was in his 60s when the second act began, and it took the rest of his life. The limp became a stick. The stick became two sticks. By the 2000s, he used a wheelchair much of the time, and by the end of his life, he used it almost entirely. There is something unbearable in the specific shape of that, and I do not think it can be said too plainly. A man who had spent 40 years in the House of Lords campaigning for wheelchair access, who had designed a powered platform for wheelchair users, who had chaired the Working Party and written the report and funded the trust, spent the last decade of his life discovering the state of British accessibility from the seat of a wheelchair. He kept working. That is the thing about him that nobody disputes, and that I find, against all my other findings, genuinely admirable. Into his late 70s and past 80, he was still taking portraits. He had a studio in Kensington, and he had assistants, and he had sitters, and they came. He photographed for the National Portrait Gallery. He photographed the Queen, more than once, over a period spanning more than 50 years, which is a remarkable professional continuity in itself. He sent out Christmas cards with his own photographs printed on them, which he had been doing since the 1950s, and continued doing until he could not. In 2008, the authorized biography by Anne de Courcy was published, and I have described what he did with it, which was to cooperate fully and let her print all of it. In 2008, he was 78 years old. and a very large part of the material in that book was material that would have been actionable if it were not true. There were exhibitions, retrospectives at the National Portrait Gallery, books of his photographs. The reputation, in the last decade of his life, settled into something close to its final shape, presture, which was that he was one of the 2 or 3 most significant British portrait photographers of the second half of the 20th century, and that the significance was not seriously in doubt. He gave a small number of interviews, he was witty in them, and he gave nothing away. Asked about Margaret, he was affectionate and vague. Asked about the marriage, he redirected. Asked about the notes, on the occasions when anybody had the nerve to ask, he did not answer. Antony Armstrong-Jones, 1st Earl of Snowdon, died at his home in Kensington on the 13th of January, 2017. He was 86 years old. The obituaries were long, and they were careful, and reading them now as a set is an education in what British journalism does when it cannot make up its mind. The Times put a photograph on the front page. The Telegraph reached for a formulation about the commoner who modernized the monarchy, which is elegant, and which does a very great deal of work in 8 words, to avoid saying anything about his private life. The Guardian was more forthright about the marriage. The BBC led its evening news with it. Almost every one of them followed the same structure, and once you notice the structure, you cannot stop noticing it. Photographer of genius. Reinvented the colour supplement. The aviary. The Emmys. The disability work, always the disability work, usually about 2/3 of the way down, and then a paragraph, sometimes 2, in which the marriage is described in language of extraordinary care. Turbulent, difficult, both parties, strains on both sides, not a happy union, 2 people in a difficult marriage. That is the formulation the British press arrived at collectively in January 2017, and it is not a lie, and it is not the truth either, and the gap between those 2 positions is where the interesting question sits. Because by 2017, all of the material was public. De Courcy had published in 2008 with his cooperation. Glenn Connor's memoir came in 2019, but she had been speaking about it for years. Craig Brown's Ma'am Darling was published in 2017, the same year he died. The note about the manicurist was in print in multiple books. The 24 Reasons were in print. Anne Hill's was in print. None of it was secret. All of it was on the record and available to any obituarist with an afternoon and a library card. And the collective decision was turbulent marriage. I do not think that was a conspiracy. I think it was something duller and more revealing, which is that the people writing those obituaries were writing about a man who had been at the center of their own trade for 50 years, who had commissioned some of them, whose work was hanging in the National Portrait Gallery, and who had just died at 86. There is a professional gravity in that situation that pulls in one direction, and it pulled. The funeral was at St. Bartholomew the Great, and it was small and it was private, and David spoke. By every account he spoke briefly and well. Sarah did not speak. Francis was there, Jasper was there, Polly Fry was not part of the official proceedings. Princess Margaret had been dead for 15 years by then. So had the Queen Mother. Peter Townsend had been dead for 22 years. Anne Hills for 20. Jeremy Fry for 12. Almost everybody who could have said anything with authority about any of it was already gone, which is one of the ways in which living to 86 functions as a form of victory. He was buried at Llanrhaeadr in Wales, near Plas Dinas, the house where he had fallen ill in 1946. There is a symmetry in that which he chose himself, and which I suspect he enjoyed choosing. The estate, the archive, the negatives. Snowdon's photographic archive is enormous, and it is a genuinely important national resource, and it has been handled properly, which is more than can be said for a good many similar collections. The Snowdon Trust continued and continues. The aviary was restored between 2019 and 2021, and reopened, and if you go to Regent's Park you can walk into it, and there are northern bald ibis flying about inside a structure that was designed by a man who failed his architecture degree and who wrote his wife a note telling her he hated her. Both facts are true about the same building. That is where this has been heading the whole time. So let me put the verdicts next to each other and weigh them, because 4 serious people have tried to sum this man up, and they arrived in 4 different places. Anne de Courcy wrote the authorized biography and had extraordinary access to him in his late 70s, And the portrait she produced is the most damaging document that exists about him. And the reason it is damaging is that she did not editorialize. She laid out the childhood, the polio, the 2 visits, the affairs, the notes, the silences, the sequence in 1976, and she let the material do the work. Her position, insofar as she takes one, is that the wound was real, and the wound does not excuse it. Craig Brown, in Ma'am Darling, is the coldest. Brown's argument is transactional. Tony wanted a career of a specific kind at a specific altitude, and marrying the Queen's sister delivered it in about 18 months, and thereafter he drew down her emotional resources for 16 years and disposed of her when the market offered him an exit that he could frame as her fault. Brown also uses the word gaslighting in 2017, before it became a dinner party term, and he means it precisely. The weakness in Brown is that he is a satirist by trade, and satire selects. He is very funny about Margaret, and the funniness occasionally does work that the evidence should be doing. Anne Glenconner is the harshest, and she is the only one who was in the room. She served Margaret for something close to 30 years. She was at the wedding, she was at the dinner parties, she was on Mystique, and her verdict in Lady-in-Waiting is that Snowdon was petty, that he was spiteful, and that he took pleasure in it. When she has spoken about him in interviews, her voice changes, and 30 years of accumulated witness is audible in it. The weakness in Glenconner, and I raise it in fairness rather than because I think it is decisive, is that she loved Margaret. She is not a neutral observer, and she does not claim to be. What she is instead is the only person who watched the whole thing at close range and lived long enough to describe it. And then there is the 4th verdict, which is Snowdon's own, delivered by omission. He never defended himself. In 57 years, from the wedding to his death, he did not once put a version of the marriage into the public record. He did not write a memoir when a memoir would have been worth a great deal. He did not brief a journalist. He did not correct anybody. He handed his authorized biographer the material that convicted him and then read the book and said nothing. The generous interpretation is that this was decency. He had children and a former wife, and he chose silence over profit. The interpretation I find more probable, and I have thought about it a lot, is that he was not interested in the charge. A man defends himself against an accusation he considers serious. Snowdon's entire observable behavior from about 1980 onward suggests a man who regarded his conduct as a husband as a matter of no historical importance whatsoever, and who cared with real intensity about how his photographs would be assessed. He was contemptuous of the question, and the contempt was so complete that it never occurred to him to answer it. That is, in its way, the most damning single fact in this account, not the note. The note was cruelty, and cruelty is common. The remarkable thing is, a man being shown the note in print at 78 years old, with his own name on the book, and not thinking it worth a word. Now, the last thing, and it is the thing that makes this more than a story about 2 unhappy people in a large apartment. Antony Armstrong-Jones changed the British monarchy, and he changed it in a direction that nobody in 1960 anticipated, and that everybody in that family has been living with ever since. Look at what he was, structurally, on the 6th of May 1960. He was the first person without a title to marry a king's daughter in 400 years. He was a working professional with a career he intended to keep. He came from the press, in the sense that he made his living from newspapers and magazines and understood exactly how they operated from the inside. He had a private life that was extensive, complicated, and entirely unmanageable by any palace press office. And he was married into the immediate royal family, with a house at Kensington Palace, and no constitutional function of any kind. Every single one of those features was new. Before Tony, the royal family married other aristocrats or foreign royals, people who had been raised inside the same set of assumptions and who understood, without being told, that the first duty was to say nothing. The system depended on that. It had depended on it for centuries. Discretion was not a policy. It was a shared instinct among a very small number of people who had all been brought up the same way. Tony was the first person to come inside who had not been brought up that way, and who had a professional relationship with the people outside the walls. I am not going to claim he caused what came afterwards, because that would be too neat and it would let a great many other people off. but look at the sequence. His divorce in 1978 was the first at the center of that family in 4.5 centuries, and it did not destroy the monarchy, and everybody noticed that it did not. Anne divorced in 1992, Andrew separated in 1992, and divorced in 1996. Charles separated in 1992, and divorced in 1996. The thing that had been unthinkable in 1955, unthinkable enough that a 25-year-old woman gave up the man she loved to prevent it, had become routine within a single generation of Margaret's own divorce. The tell-all book. Andrew Morton's Diana in 1992, the tapes, the Dimbleby interview, the Panorama interview, the transcripts printed in newspapers, the staff memoirs, the 60 years of leakage that has followed. The premise underneath all of it is that the private life of a royal marriage is publishable material. That premise was established in 1976, on a beach on Mystique, in a photograph in the News of the World, and its immediate consequence was exploited by a member of the royal family against another member of the royal family for personal advantage. He was the first of the new kind. The person inside the family who treated the family as material, who understood the press because he came from it, who lived his private life in a manner that could not be contained, and who worked out before anybody else did that the leak had become a weapon that could be pointed inward. Everything the Windsors have gone through since 1992, all of it, the books and the interviews and the recordings, and the two brothers not speaking, and the whole slow public unmaking, has happened inside a world where that is possible. And it became possible in stages, and the first stage arrived at Westminster Abbey on a Friday in May 1960, in morning dress, with a limp and a Pimlico studio and a pregnant mistress across town. An ordinary Welsh boy walked up that aisle and brought the 20th century in behind him. The family has never worked out what to do about it, and I am not sure the family understands, even now, that it happened. Here is where I leave it. Princess Margaret was 25 years old when she was told that the man she loved was not available to her, and she did as she was asked, in a written statement, invoking a principle about the permanence of marriage. She was told, in effect, that the institution required a sacrifice, and that she was the one who had to make it. She made it. She then married a man who spent 16 years demonstrating to her, in handwriting, that she had made it for nothing. And when it ended, the same institution that had extracted the sacrifice processed her divorce without much difficulty at all, because the world had moved, and the rule she had been broken on had been abandoned somewhere along the way, without anybody telling her. She kept his ring on until she died. She kept Peter Townsend's photograph beside her bed for the same 24 years. She died at 71, on a February morning, with her son and her daughter in the room, 7 weeks before her mother. And Antony Armstrong-Jones lived another 15 years, working, honoured, in a wheelchair, in Kensington, and never said a word about any of it, and his aviary is still standing in Regent's Park with the birds inside. That is the marriage. Both of them, all of it, without the tidying up. Thank you for staying with this one, and I mean that, because it was long, and it was not an easy watch, and you had other options. If you got something out of it, subscribe, because this is what we do here every week, and we go this deep every time. Ring the bell so you actually see the next one, and if you know somebody who has only ever had the television version of Margaret and Snowdon, send them this. And do me a favor in the comments, tell me which one of them you find yourself thinking about tonight. Margaret at 25, giving up Townsend for a rule that was abandoned in her own lifetime without anybody telling her. Anne Hills, 20 years in, on a roof on New Year's Eve. Polly Fry, 44 years old, finding out from a laboratory. Jeremy Fry, who raised her anyway and never said a word to anybody. Or David and Sarah, who watched all of it from a corridor in Kensington Palace and have spent 50 years choosing, every single time they were asked, to say nothing. Tell me who you would want to hear from, if you could only pick one. And if you want the reading, the 4 books this was built from are Anne de Courcy's Snowdon, which he cooperated with and never contested, Craig Brown's Ma'am Darling, Anne Glenconner's Lady-in-Waiting, and Christopher Warwick's Authorized Life of Margaret. Start with the Glenconner. She was in the room for 30 years, and she does not spare anybody, including her own class, including herself. I will see you in the next one.